Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the Climate Emergency Mobilizations Task Force Second Virtual Summit Series, United Actions for an Environmentally Just and Regenerative Future. This is our fourth in the series, and it's ecological protection. Good morning. Thank you for being here. I'm Cheryl Davrila, founder of the Climate Emergency Mobilization Task Force and former council member for the city of Berkeley. We're here today to discuss ecological protection, ecological, involved with or concerning ecology, protection to give or be protected against something unpleasant or from being harmed or damaged. Sadly, we all know that we haven't done a good job protecting the ecology, the environment, or our planet. We are reminded of this damage that we've caused to the planet in various ways. The damage occurs by the recent flash flooding on throughout the country, like on the East Coast, New York for the first time, the hurricanes and tornadoes, which prompted up in some places for the first time, the fires, the smoke, the droughts, all the effects on our health, air, water, and the inequities exacerbated by the pandemic. COVID-19 is uncovering the disparities embedded with societies throughout the world that lacked ecological protection. We must do better. I'd like to thank you again for joining us this morning, and go get your coffee, your breakfast, your water, sit back and relax. I'd like to thank everyone who helped get this event together today. The Climate Emergency Mobilization Task Force Steering Committee, the Planning and Logistics, Legislative, Design and Outreach Committees, as well as all of the speakers that are here today, the panelists, the facilitators, and the volunteers behind the scene, because without all of you, we could not do this. And again, for all of you for your presence, I want to thank you for being here. We will begin our day with a wonderful, beautiful woman that I love, Karina Gould, the chair and spokesperson for the Confederated Villages of Lejeune Ohlone, founder of the Sigurte Land Trust. And if you haven't signed up to pay your Shumi tax, please do. Thank you, Karina, for being here.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I am so happy to be here with you. Good morning, everyone. I think we're going to start off with a land acknowledgement. And interestingly, land acknowledgements started happening in other parts of the world before they came here. In Australia and in Canada, people have been doing land acknowledgements for many years now. And what is a land acknowledgement except to acknowledge the things that happened in our lands, the first people, nations who took care of those lands. And then I always think it's important when people are doing land acknowledgement to talk about what is the action items that we're going to do going forward, and reciprocity with each other living together again. When Indigenous people do land acknowledgements on their own home territory, we acknowledge our ancestors that have been here since the beginning of time. The picture that you see behind me is Tuyshtak. Tuyshtak is our sacred mountain. Native people are connected to a mountain and a waterway. And so this mountain, Tuyshtak, is what people in the Bay Area know as Mount Diablo. This is where our creation story began. People from all over the world have creation stories about where their people came from. And this is our creation story. We believe that we were created off the top of Tuyshtak when there was a flood here in this lands. And at the very top of Tuyshtak was our creator who sent people out in all directions. And so the Confederated Villages of Lejeune are a confederation of those people that were created on top of Tushtak. So we are created, and we are Ohlone and Bay Miwok and Plains Miwok and Delta Yokut and Patwin, all created off the top of this mountain here. And so it is our responsibility then to take care of these lands. But we live here in our territory with all of you, people that have come from many different parts of the world to make this place, the Bay Area, their home. And so now it is our responsibility together to take care of the land and the waterways, the air, and our people here and all that live here with us. And so we're going to start this morning off by taking a deep breath. And this week has been amazing and fast paced for me, and maybe it has been for you. And so we're going to let some of that go today as we take a deep breath in. We're going to let some of that go so we can be present with each other. So we're going to breathe in for a count of 4 and breathe out for a count of 8 and let that stuff go for right now. So take a deep breath in and out for 8. We bring in all kinds of knowledges, past, present, and future knowledges. We carry our ancestors with us, and they hold us up from below and above, from the sides of us, in front of us, and behind us. And as they do that, we ask that they help us to open our hearts and our minds and our ears to the work that we have ahead of us for the next 7 generations. So we take in another deep breath and out. On our minds and hearts are our relatives that are sick with COVID, are sick with other diseases, are struggling with climate disaster problems right now, our relatives that live on the streets without a roof over their heads, those that have less water and less food than we do, less security, less food security. We bring them into this room as we make decisions about the things that we want to do to bring us back into right relationships. I'm taking a deep breath and we let it go. With this last deep breath, I want us to take in anything that we have that's bothering us today, anything in our personal life, anything that we need to take care of right now that we need help with. I want us to remember that we have to take care of ourselves in order for us to have an impact on what happens in the next 7 generations. So we can continue to do this work for many, many years and to pass that on to the next generation. So let's take in a deep breath for our own selves, our bodies, our minds, our spirits, and let it go. I hope we're all settled and ready to be here this morning. I thank you so much for always inviting me to be a part of this beautiful work that we're doing together in collaboration with one another to for our next generations, our next 7 generations. And that's always what we do. As Indigenous people, our thoughts, our ways of being, our epistemologies, our teachings have always been to think about the next 7 generations. And so it makes you pause when you make a decision. What are you going to do? What decision are you going to make in this world? And how is that going to affect the next 7 generations after you're gone? And I think that that's where we're trying to get to. We're trying to go backwards in order to go forwards again. We're trying to reimagine what this world can be with equity and inclusion, but also how do we decolonize our minds, which is different than equity and inclusion. Decolonizing our minds is to go back at a time before other people came here with that thought process. To reimagine that Indigenous people, wherever they are in the world, actually had a relationship to the land and had been there for thousands of years and knew how the lands worked and the waterways worked, and that those teachings that they had for thousands of years actually may help all of us move forward to help to get away from or to save us from this natural disaster that's coming for us, or man-made disaster. Cheryl asked me to talk about the Sigurte Land Trust today. And so I'm going to share a little bit of information for those of you that don't have information. I'm going to share my screen this morning, and I'm just going to do a little bit of a presentation, and then I want to, let's see if it'll go. Here we go. So the Sigurte Land Trust is the first urban indigenous women-led land trust in the country, and it happens to be right here in the Bay Area, and it happens to be right here in my homelands, the lands that I have always been born to. It's an urban indigenous women-led land trust because it's not just Ohlone people that it affects. In the 1950s, there were policies by the U.S. government that forced relocation of other indigenous peoples into the Bay Area, Denver, Chicago, New York, LA, and a few other places. And so those indigenous people that have come from reservations during that time sometimes have 3 generations living here now that have never been able to go home. So it was important for us to reconnect indigenous people to landways. Janella LaRose is the co-founder of the Saguarte Land Trust, and she and I have been working for about 2.5 decades together to preserve and protect the sacred sites of my ancestors here in the Bay Area, joined by people always from all walks of life to acknowledge the ancestors on this land and the protection of these sacred places that we don't see in the landscape today and are often hidden by buildings and railroad tracks and parking lots. You see, sometimes people think of Ohlone people as one group of people, just kind of shoved all together. And that's because our history that's taught to us in elementary school teaches us that way. But there are actually 8 different nations of people with 8 different languages. Our songs and our dances are different. And this is a map that kind of shows where people were. We are connected by languages, but there was never one overarching tribe in any of these places. And so for people that don't understand that, I like to explain it. If you understand Alameda County or any county, and there's a county and we all speak the similar language, but each of those counties have different cities inside of them. And each of those cities are in charge of their own municipalities, and they decide which cities they're going to have conversations with and who they're going to create relationships with. The same was happening thousands of years ago in the Bay Area under these language areas. And so there was never one overarching tribe in any of these lands or for Ohlone people, which is a generic term. The Sigurte Land Trust is an urban indigenous land trust that facilitates the return of indigenous lands to indigenous people. To rematriate is to restore a people to their rightful place in sacred relationship with their ancestral lands. I believe that rematriation also is indigenous women's work. It tries to bring into balance what has been taken away from us through colonization across the world. When we talked about starting an urban indigenous women-led land trust, Janella and I had a conversation about what was missing. And what we did was we really correlated what happened along the way in colonization and who has been in charge of land for the last 1,000 years. And we noticed that who was in charge of land was not the women. Who was in charge of land were men. And as those things happened, the lands that were taken as colonization swept across the world, the sacredness was taken from the land, but it was also taken from women. It was the extraction of what we call our Mother Earth. It was also an extraction and rape of the women that happened on the land. And so to bring that balance back is to bring back indigenous knowledges about how do we take care of the land? How do we bring back into balance what our roles are to take care of the lands? And as women have roles of singing to waters and to birthing babies and to helping our relatives pass over and to creating this different relationship. We also know that our relatives, our sons, our husbands, our uncles, our brothers, all have been taken away from their own sacred relationship to lands. And so it is really to bring a balance back into that work. We are Lishan people, and our waterway is the waterway of the Lishan, both the San Leandro and San Lorenzo Creeks, as one of our waterways connected to our mountain. Lishan is also the first place that we were given land back in our territory in 250 years. Ohlone people are homeless in their own homeland until we started Sigurte Land Trust. We were given back a 1/4 acre of land on a 2-acre plot in deep East Oakland called Sabrani Park, right along our channeled waterway where the freeway, the 880, butts up against it. Where the 880 freeway is, many of you may know, is that it's on fill. And so as we're talking about climate disaster, this whole area from the airport all the way up to the freeway is in danger of being flooded out again. Our ancestors always created our village sites along waterways where salt water met fresh water, where marshes were. And so this quite literally could be one of the village sites of our ancestors' homes. We decided that when we returned to the land, we got this land back from Planting Justice, who is a nonprofit organization that works with formerly incarcerated men and women, that we would create a relationship with them. We would work with them first for a year before we said yes definitively to the land, even though we had been homeless on our own homeland. And we decided that we were going to create an arbor. It's a dance place, a place of gathering, a place that our ancestors had gathered for thousands of years, and it had not been on our territory for 250 years. And so we gathered up logs from Sonoma in a place that a friend of a friend had some land. And they allowed us to take down these redwood trees in order to create this beautiful spot again for our children's children. And none of us had any idea how to take down trees, but there was this young African-American man who worked with Planting Justice, who had been formerly incarcerated and was on fires every year. And this young man could talk to trees. And we trusted him to be our lead as we asked these relatives, our trees, for their lives so that we can build this gathering space. And so we did. And you can see a portion of one of these trees weighed over 700 pounds. So it took a lot of us to move them. We thought when we brought them back to Oakland, we would put them up in a month, and those trees taught us a lot of lessons. And one of the lessons they taught us was that we needed to stop and slow down. And we brought people from all walks of life to ready that land to put this grand arbor up. People from different religious backgrounds, people from different sexual orientations, people from every different color came, and they helped us to put their hands on these logs to take off the bark, to get them ready, to ready the land, to create the holes for them. And it took us a year to do that. And finally, 2 years ago in May, we put up this arbor and put it up intentionally with a women's log and a man's log, a youth log and an elder's log, and a log for our two spirit relatives who continue to be oppressed in all of our lands. And we put these logs up with intention and prayer. Janelle and I could never imagine in all of the years that we have been working together that we could see something come to fruition. But those prayers have been laid down for us to do this work by our ancestors. This is our arbor, who has not been traditionally danced in yet, but has been used over COVID for fires, for relatives that have passed away, for places for people to come and pray when they're coming out of prison, to ask for protection as they go home, and for my daughter's wedding during COVID, where I was able to officiate my daughter getting married. And so it is a place of great beauty, a place of gathering, a place where we can come together and mourn and celebrate. Our young people are learning how to weave again, how to put together our materials again, to create a space that not only beautifies, but it enhances our lands for our elders. And so this is a tule mat that we use to sleep on and to build houses with and boats with and to create shade structures. And that first year we had a little hummingbird come and live with us inside that space. So she must have felt really good to have her babies there. We invite people to come in and pray. And this is 500-mile runners who spiritual runs that have been running since 1978 to lay down prayers. And this particular prayer was for the missing and murdered Indigenous women. And they came and asked permission to come onto the land to put those prayers down there. We're growing our medicinal plants that we have been have not had any land to grow on or have relationships with for hundreds of years, and those medicines are coming back. We're working to gather our medicinal plants and our foods, and our young people are learning how to do this. And this is my grandson, who's holding a whole bunch of soap root, which is a plant that we use to create brushes and to eat and to do a few other things. We're bringing back our language classes, and for intergenerational. Our language had been asleep since 1937 when my great-grandfather, Jose Guzman, he was one of the last speakers of the language, but we were reawakening that language for the land to hear it again. And we're sharing that language through signage and through our young people and through creating ways for us to re-engage with everyone on our land. We take care of a garden that we renamed Ramai, and Ramai in our language means west. In West Oakland, we have a small community garden that has fruit trees, and we've recreated more community garden beds for people in West Oakland to come and garden, as it's one of the places that has really bad soil and also no place to grow in a lot of ways. So the tobacco and sage plants, and our young people working on creating those beds. And these trees have cherries, we have plums, we have apples, pears, figs, and all of that food goes to a food distribution that we've been doing since COVID. We've created Hamekas, which means a place where we all gather. And it's a place for climate disaster times. When man-made or natural-made disasters happen, we know that there are certain places that people are not going to, nobody's going to come to save. And in deep East Oakland, in Saguarte, we know that that's true. So we have created these Hamekas, a place for us to be prepared. We have freshwater tanks that we have there. We are growing our own medicinal plants and teas that we have available. We have first aid there. We're going to put solar panels up. And we have water catchment systems that these young folks are putting up right now, and praying for rain so that we can catch that water and take care of our relatives. We're building out an outdoor kitchen, so there'll be a place for people to eat food. And so we do all of this because with the generosity of people that live in our territory. We ask people that if you live, work, or play in LaShawn territory, that you help us out in doing this work. You engage in this work by giving shumi. And shumi in our language means a gift. It's a way for us to work in reciprocity to make sure that this work gets done. And on our website at the Sigurte Land Trust, you can calculate your shumi. You can pay monthly or you can pay yearly. And we ask that this is how we engage. We ask people to come out and help us on the land when it's safe, and we were hoping that it was going to be safe recently, and we had to back out again. But I want to thank you all for the opportunity to talk to you about the work that we're doing, and look forward to doing more work with all of you around how do we help each other? How do we see each other as human beings across all lines in order to save ourselves and our humanity?
Thank you so much, Karina. Every time you're here, it's just such a blessing, and I learned something new. And I just dropped the Sigurte Land Trust Shumi Land Tax link in the chat, so everyone can check that out and pay their taxes. And I'm going to turn it over to Amos White, who's on our steering committee. And take it away, Amos. Thank you.
Thank you, Cheryl. And thank you, Karina, for your presentation and words. And I too pay a Shumi tax, and I would also support everyone explore what that means and to support, if you will, through paying a Shumi tax as well. I want to thank our co-chairs, Jack Lucero Fleck and Steve Nadell, for really pulling this summit together, and organizers Karina Templis, Elaine McCarty, and Ruth Abbey here on the front side for bringing this summit forward today. This is our 4th Climate Emergency Mobilization Task Force Summit. Today, we're going to hear from expert speakers, practitioners, organizers, change makers, and policy specialists on ecological protection. Each of them are working on some aspect of that positively seeks to protect the greater ecological systems we have, our flora and our fauna. And it was an excellent point. I really appreciate your words, Karina, where you said that, you know, we need to restore a relationship of people with the land. And that's really what we're trying to get to in terms of bringing about that balance on our planet, I should say, to restore climate and restore a healthy relationship with the earth. The loss and degradation of forests make up around 12% of human-caused carbon dioxide emissions. In the land sector as a whole, that we'll be hearing from today, experts and people working in those fields, including agriculture, forests, and other land uses, the land sector is responsible for nearly a quarter of global emissions. So ecosystem protection is really a critical part of drawing down CO2 emissions, restoring degraded lands, and enhancing existing ecosystems, which absorb CO2. Today, coming up first, we're going to hear from a panel on regenerative agriculture, subtitled Using Local Policy to Rebuild the Soil and Sequester Carbon. Our own Ruth Abbey, who is the founder and lead of CASA in Alameda, will be facilitating that with speakers Anthony Myatt of Zero Footprint, Kevin Drew of City and County of San Francisco, and Cala Ostrinder of Phoenix Rising Resources. After that, we're going to have what's called a Mentimeter, and our Elaine McCarty will take you through that. It's an exercise we have to take the pulse of where you are. And then following that will be our second panel on forest and land management for climate protection. That will be facilitated by Elaine McCarty. The speakers there will be Chad Hansen of the John Muir Project, Maya Khosla, who's a biologist, Gary Hughes of Biofuel Watch. We'll take a short bio break at 11:15 for everybody to stretch, grab another espresso or a glass of water, and then we'll reconvene at 11:20 with our third and final panel on protecting marine ecosystems. That'll be facilitated by Sylvia Gibson of SF Bay Hope Spots. And the speakers will be Sylvia and Liz Taylor of Doer Marine. Want to wrap things up right on time if we can this summit, as we've pretty much done with our last ones. At 11:45, Jack will come back with our wrap up, and then also to introduce what our next couple panels will be, and we'll have some final closing remarks from Cheryl. With that, I'd like to welcome our first panel again, and Ruth Abbey will be facilitating that. Ruth?
Thanks so much, Amos, and good morning and welcome, everyone. We are so excited to be presenting this panel today. With our work, we oftentimes talk about climate mitigation, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, or climate adaptation, where we're preparing for the inevitability of climate impacts. But this panel will be presenting strategies that communities can actually do to reverse the effects of climate change and global warming. So we're very excited, first of all, to introduce Anthony Myatt, who is a chef, a restaurateur, an advocate, and someone who will really be making a difference in our world. He is the co-founder of Zero Footprint, and he is going to give us a little bit of an introduction to this concept of carbon sequestration, soil carbon sequestration, and also tell us a little bit about his work with Zero Footprint. Thanks so much, Anthony.
Well, thank you, Ruth. Thank you, everybody, for your work on climate solutions, and to CEMTF for organizing this event and having me. As Ruth mentioned, I'm a chef. At this point, I would say more probably associated with being a climate crusader. The restaurants that you may know if you're in the Bay Area are Mission Chinese Food, The Perennial, and Commonwealth. But I have essentially sort of like gone all in on agricultural climate solutions and carbon farming and regenerative agriculture. And in part, it's because it's so optimistic. But I'm not here to just, I'll set the stage and tell you about regenerative ag, but I also want to say that there's an extremely live opportunity in policy right now in relation to SB 1383. Others may touch on it, but essentially it is scaling up organic matter diversion by 75%, or like a reduction of 75% relative to 2014 numbers. So like radical changes are happening right now in California. There will be 90 new facilities, Cal Recycle estimates, and also actionable for everybody on this call who's a policymaker, like individual jurisdictions will be purchasing compost and mulch and biofuel as part of this new legislation or regulation. However, the way the regulation is structured, there is unfortunately likely to be kind of a race to the bottom in terms of quality of compost and environmental outcomes. And so we're uniquely positioned to help create kind of a race to the top and the most climate optimal outcomes and compost quality, meeting kind of like a level of agricultural suitability. So if we have time, we can get into the weeds on that or in the Q&A. But at first, I'll try to just set the stage on regenerative ag. Sorry, let me get into the slideshow. Maybe someone give me a thumbs up if you're seeing kind of a rainbow looking thing.
Looks good.
Thanks. So this is background from a great organization called Project Drawdown. Some of you may know this or the work that they do, but it's basically a meta-analysis from a lot of different climate experts in different solution fields. So, it could be renewable energy, wind power, it could be educating girls, it could be reducing food waste, forestry, all the different solutions. Experts in each field estimated the plausible adoption rate of each strategy. From there, they estimated kind of like the cost benefit analysis, how many billions of tons of carbon could be removed from the atmosphere and how many dollars it would take to implement at that rate, and then how many dollars it would save and benefit society. So first of all, let's just take a quick moment to acknowledge the opportunity here. What Project Drawdown found and confirms is basically we can completely solve the climate crisis and lower global temperatures. We can reduce and remove a trillion tons of carbon from our current trajectory or the atmosphere. And doing so would cost about $29 trillion. That's a lot of money, but by the same token, that's just 1% of GDP each year. So temperatures can go down if we can find a way to mobilize 1% of GDP. It's also kind of hard to go from 0.0% ever for climate to 1%. So I feel like in a nutshell, that almost is the whole struggle. Can this group find that kind of funding? And Zero Footprint began as a restaurant-facing program, but I think in a lot of ways we've sort of leveled up to almost like a capital deployment program. You could think of it as like a regenerative pipeline that can turn funding into carbon farming. So I'll get into that, but I think basically as policymakers, we've started to have these collaborations with like California Department of Food and Ag or local RCDs or local jurisdictions. And I think in a lot of cases, everyone is kind of like good people. Government is trying to solve the problem. There's not enough funding. That's ultimately what it always comes down to. Everybody would want to do more, but there's not enough funding in the budget. And so, this is also an invitation to encourage everybody here to start focusing on public-private collaborations to unlock collective action and funding from citizens. Everybody, I know thousands of people who want to take climate action, they just don't know how to do so in a meaningful and streamlined way. Or, if you invited them to do it, maybe they would think about it or whatever. But you could just create a choice architecture system where if money's automatically flowing to it optionally, and then everybody would be psyched, to just not have to think about it and be part of the solution. But going back to regenerative ag really quick, this is this kind of rainbow looking thing is a chart of the opportunity. So not the causes of climate or the, the different, sources of emissions, but the opportunity to reduce or remove in each sector. So you see here, I've done little orange boxes around food, agriculture, and land use and land sinks. And so combined, those are bigger than electricity and transportation. So basically the biggest climate opportunity. This is also just at the plausible rate of adoption. So it's not even like the biological potential, but just what's deemed plausible by the experts at the moment. But what would have been plausible in renewable energy 30 years ago is like way, much more progress now is plausible. So I would encourage you to like not think too hard about this scientific consensus for each, farm project or something like that, each farm practice, but more like just the simple common sense that there's billions of acres and of agricultural land, and soil globally holds like 3 times the carbon of the atmosphere, and we can use that to start taking carbon out of the atmosphere. The other comment or finding from Drawdown is that strategies like regenerative cropping and managed grazing provide about $40 of benefit per dollar invested. So that's through water conservation, resilience, carbon removal, and farmer prosperity. You could think of it as the soil wealth. So basically, if you're thinking about like, should we do some strategy that's like an air conditioner, taking carbon out of the atmosphere and what's the cost per ton or whatever, or should we do some strategy like regenerative ag? Regenerative ag is a locally beneficial climate solution that is completely proven and is just waiting for money to flow into the system. So when we began this work with California, what was exciting was to re-envision regenerative ag as kind of inevitable in the same way that renewable energy is now seen as kind of inevitable. And so trying to create these choice architecture mechanisms that unlock collective action in the same way that renewable energy has made great progress through CCA policy and framework. Imagine 20 or 30 years ago, if you were like, hey, the whole city of San Francisco, San Diego, San Jose will commit to 100% renewable energy. That would almost be unthinkable, right? Like that at that time. Now it's like, ho hum, everybody understands the concept of improving the grid. It just began like 10 or 5 years ago, depending on where you are. Challenge with regenerative ag is, while it's just as inevitable, the UN says we have 60 harvests left and we're sitting here in drought and wildfire, so we absolutely need to change 50% of acres, 80% of acres. The challenge is that basically, when it comes to energy, you can just build like one solar farm or whatever and plug it into the grid. Everybody gets that. When it comes to regenerative ag, the implementation and deployment of capital would be really complex across, thousands of farms, each with their own nuances and all these small businesses. But there's no reason that we couldn't just start getting $5 per month from the trash bill to get the compost that's already going to start to be created by SB 1383 onto farms and ranches in a climate optimal way. There's no reason we couldn't get 1% from restaurants or something like that to do that. In California, 1% from the restaurant industry could have generated $970 million per year pre-COVID. So if you can imagine going to a restaurant and the sandwich, that used to be $10 or something, now it's $10.10. If you can even imagine paying that extra 10 cents and not being like totally freaked out or pissed off about it, then you can imagine $970 million a year going towards locally beneficial climate solutions. So we're standing by to help make that happen. Since we began the program in January 2020, we've distributed about 31 grants to farms, over $500,000, expected to remove 18,000 tons of carbon from the atmosphere. So that's equal to not burning about 2 million gallons of gas. In Boulder, Colorado, we just began with Boulder County and City of Denver, and we've already got a Subway franchisee sending a few cents per sandwich at 5 locations of Subway to scale regenerative ag. So this is not like a small movement of, hey, some rich person go buy the $5 cherry tomatoes at the farmer's market and let's hope everything starts changing. This is the beginning of a new normal where every single industry can support regenerative agriculture. One thing that makes it possible is the Comet Planner tool. So this is developed by Colorado State and the USDA's Natural Resource Conservation Service. It takes soil data from the USDA and combines it with carbon sequestration science and data that's coming in, and the model keeps getting improved. But basically it allows like an individual or a consumer, a farmer, a policymaker to estimate the benefit of a carbon farming practice in less than a minute. This is a screen capture from a project we did with Trash Dairy in Sonoma. So it's compost application, a little bit of detail about the compost, carbon nitrogen ratio, et cetera. The county, Sonoma, and the acres, 23. And then the model can say, you know, with some confidence, this is taking about 99.1 tons of carbon out of the atmosphere per year. So now we have the tools to understand how, you know, dollars can relate to carbon sequestration. So it's just time to get started. This is a peek at our grant database and how Zero Footprint is making the grant decisions. Sorry, it's kind of complicated, so I'll run through it like super quickly. We can share the deck, or I'm always available to discuss this, but basically each row is a farmer applicant. So this first farmer is saying they want to apply compost and mulch and plant trees and shrubs on 18 acres. Farmer works with the local, in this case, the Cooperative Extension, the UC Agricultural and Natural Resources Department. A lot of our projects are with the RCD, so a lot of you may be like in contact with your local resource conservation district. But basically, let's call that a technical assistance provider, or TAP. So the farmer works with the TAP. Oftentimes the TAP needs some funding to cover their time working on the project with the farmer. You know, they'll walk the land, form a plan. If you're planting cover crops, you know, it's like plant 40 pounds of cover crop seed, this kind of mix for each acre. You know, if it's applying compost, they may be like, hey, don't put it over there. It's a 12-degree slope, or these kinds of technical expertise. You know, overall, sorry, I should even backtrack and just say like regenerative agriculture could be considered farming with nature or building healthy soil, but it's also just practices that a lot of good farmers know, like applying compost, planting cover crops, reducing tillage. And the problem is just that the conventional food system and food economy doesn't really incentivize those practices. It almost disincentivizes healthy soil. You know, farmers have like crop insurance and, you know, subsidies essentially to use chemical fertilizers and plow and, you know, release carbon into the atmosphere. You know, on a moment-to-moment basis, we can't adjust the federal farm bill and kind of unwind the whole food system, but the problem is not too big to tackle. You know, individual farmers are standing by to take money and switch practices. California has a healthy soils program, and in the last round, something like 560 farmers applied for funding in the first month. So they had to shut down the program because they couldn't even review the applications. So again, anybody that wants to use any money towards local climate solutions, we're standing by. But I'll flip through this you know, chart really quick and just say the cooperative extension in this case needs 2,000, the farmer wants 14,000. We're considering that kind of like a competitive bid or grant request. So the total cost of this project is 16,000. Using that model on the previous page, the total sequestration estimate is around 1,195 tons. And then we're basically just dividing. So there's kind of like the best bang for your buck, the best climate ROI, the dollars per ton of carbon removal. We give some bonuses to BIPOC growers and growers that are in the supply chain of member businesses. So it's almost like a carbon inset, or, you know, true kind of circular economy. But basically the purpose of going so deep into these numbers is just to say, if you wanted to improve the grid of food and farming, this is how you could do it. We've kind of like cracked the code or found a way to work with local conservation experts to systematically and optimally and equitably distribute funds to local carbon farming projects. So, you know, whether it's $50,000 from a government budget or $5 per month on the trash bill or 10 cents per sandwich, you know, whatever the case might be, there's now a way to do this. A county could set up a local healthy soils program, you know, and work with us on it, work with the RCDs on it. You know, we're not trying to even like own or run the program. We could just help get it started and then hand it off. It doesn't even matter. I want to do one last thing, which is just to say, going back to that thought experiment of like a county or something committing to 100% regenerative ag. So I was actually just talking with Linda Hopkins, the supervisor of District 5 in Sonoma County, and you know, she's part of the local climate ad hoc. They're starting to figure out like what would be creative funding solutions for climate beneficial farming practices. I think she's also invited to like go to COP26 and like, you know, learn there and stuff. But so here's kind of a sketch. You know, this is completely my speculation and not something Sonoma has committed to, but it's kind of a why not? I want to just skip right to the bottom in the interest of time, but say Sonoma County could generate $34 million per year to change about 34,000 acres per year and eventually change the whole county's agriculture in about 20 years. And this is how they could do it, just as one, you know, layperson's estimate: 1% from the restaurant industry, 1% on wine, $5 per month on the trash bill, and 1% from the transient occupancy tax. That would be enough to set a global precedent and make a commitment to 100% regenerative ag and really start mobilizing this kind of huge climate opportunity from carbon farming. So it's totally possible. If you can imagine, again, the $10 sandwich becoming $10.10, then you can imagine the problem being solved. I'm going to turn it over to Kevin and the others to talk about a lot of really great stuff going on with compost and jurisdictions right now.
Thanks so much, Anthony. Really appreciate all of your work and inspiration. I wanted to invite Kevin Drew to tell us the story of his activism behind the scenes at the City and County of San Francisco, where he has worked on zero waste recycling, composting, and now climate change solutions. So Kevin, you want to tell us about your work and where you're hoping to solve all our problems?
Thanks,
Awesome.
Ruth, and thanks, Anthony, and thanks to the organizers. I especially wanted to thank Karina for that incredible presentation around the land, the Ohlone lands. That the story was so complete, and I hadn't heard such a good story in a long time. And I think it really comes back to where we recognizing the place that we are and the impact that we can have. So let me share my screen. I'm the senior zero waste specialist at the Department of the Environment. I've been working there for 20 years and worked for 15 years before that in recycling mostly, but my path has been through organizing, as Ruth mentioned, and I've been really drawn to the organic side of things, from starting with kind of bottles and cans to finding the organic sector is really the most powerful place, as Anthony was just describing. It's where our food comes from. It's where the carbon is coming from, both into the atmosphere and needs to come back into the ground to create the best future for us all. So let me just tell you a quick story about how San Francisco, what we've done over the course of the past 25 years. So yes, we've got 25 years of experience, and you all know San Francisco. It's a dense city. How do we manage to get the material out of the city and out to where it needs to be? The high rises are one problem. Down at the bottom of this picture is Chinatown, which is an almost 200-year-old community that's deeply embedded and very tight spaces, and it's hard to get the food out of there, but that's where a lot of the food is. So we've really done, I think, a good job at capturing that material and showing that it can be captured instead of wasted in landfills. It can be captured in our what we call Fantastic Three, the three bins that we've had again in place for over 25 years. The green bin in the middle there is the key. The blue for the recycling bottles and cans, and the black for what's left over. In this case, we reduced our black bin down to 16 gallons from, it had been, the standard was 32. We need to go lower than that, and we need to continue to fill up the green container. But through our program, we've been able to capture about 700,000 tons of organics a year, which turns into about 250,000 tons of compost. And the other tool that we've given people is just, it's in your kitchen. It really starts in your kitchen. That's where all the food is. This kitchen pail is a simple tool, but it works very well. I no longer use the compostable bag. We're moving away from that because that is complicated for the processing. But by doing this, you're really capturing the value of the natural value that's in our world around us that we use every day that we were wasting. And it really just, to Anthony's point, it's simple. There is a very simple set of steps that we can come back to recover all this material. About 5 years ago, Cala Rose, who'll be speaking in a moment, and I were thinking about the kind of compost that we were generating. Those are pictures on the right of the compost loader moving the material around at Jepson Prairie Organics, where our material goes. And it's just an enormous amount of resource that needs to get back onto the land. So we did a spreadsheet there on the left of a draft of what could be accomplished by putting this compost in different locations around the Bay Area and in the highest and best use, which at that time was working with rangeland, following the guidance of the Marine Carbon Project. And we came up with incredible amounts of sequestration, 50% by 2035 and maybe 180%. Those numbers were not at that time sufficiently researched. It's a good number, and there's, as Anthony was pointing out, there's really a tremendous amount to be made, but we needed to go back and do a better job at creating those numbers so that we could share that information with everyone. And essentially that's where we're at now. I mean, in a way, Anthony has I think his story is, it's not so much about the technical numbers, it's that it's doable and we need to get on with it. So this is a quick screenshot of the urban drawdown initiatives map for how cities can take the information that's been gathered both by the USDA, again, that Anthony mentioned with the Comet planner, and the local areas with like the RCDs, the resource conservation districts, can help, but cities can now take their materials and direct it in a fashion that is the highest and best use. And that's really what SB 1383 that Anthony mentioned is forcing every city to do, but we really need to turn that from a forcing into it and not be a race to the bottom, but rather an opportunity to turn the economy. Again, as Anthony was pointing out, the economy will forever be different. The wasteful practices, the thoughtless practices essentially that we engaged in can be replaced by what really are natural, logical, and not so hard. Don't want to say simple, but steps that can be taken now by cities and counties up and down the state of California and around the planet. This is another screenshot from that same tool that, again, Cala will talk a little bit more about. And I just wanted to introduce this as another way for cities to step up and say, we can do this. Because what Anthony was describing was a way for the public to be involved. And I think that's just as important as the government. But they do have to work together. And we need public pressure at the grassroots level to help our cities and counties go ahead and take the initiative to make the plans and mobilize the funding to create an infrastructure. Actually, this is too many words. This is just another calculation, kind of like what Anthony was talking about. I'm going to go back to this, that it's really about what you can do in your kitchen, what you can do in the lunchroom at your place of work. We've spent time and money going around and talking to people at all those levels. At the same time, we've been doing it for 20 years, and now we're moving into a stage of more enforcement. It is the right thing to do. People know the system is out there. Sometimes they're lazy and they don't do it right. We have to catch them when they do it wrong and tell them they did it wrong and tell them how to do it right. And then we have to actually, possibly have fines and, increases in your rates if you don't do it right. And again, continue to have incentives for doing it the right way. But it is not such a great, it's not a great distance that we have to go. Again, as Anthony was pointing out, the 10 cents that he was talking about on a sandwich, $10 sandwich, the $5 a month or something that you would subscribe to as kind of like the clean energy programs we have. All of these are things that I feel they're very much in reach. And again, as the Healthy Soils program shows and Anthony's work shows, there's farmers that are ready to go, but there's a hell of a lot of farmers that we have to get to. So we need everyone to be doing this in order to create the volume of both compost and need for that, identified need for that to make the match. And again, that's what the tools that Cala will talk about are about. And you've got kind of the methodology that Anthony has as one way to kind of mobilize people at a grassroots level. You've got kind of an administrative regulatory structure coming down from 1383 from the state level to help each community get going on this. And I think you have all of us. We are the activists who have been working in different ways to make this happen, whether it was renewable energy or land policies, native peoples. All of those stories seem to me to be in a position to come together and create a movement that is very doable for making a difference. What's at stake here is obviously the climate and the planet, But what's interesting about it is that so much of it is just solving the soil where you are, either right in your own neighborhood or in the neighborhood where the food is grown, not too far from where you live. A Bay Area is full of food growing of one sort or another, and all of our food we're almost in touch with it. So that this whole practice, this is where you meld the indigenous and native stories about how close we are to the land to our actual current reality. The Bay Area likes to think it's in touch with that. We can be in touch with that. We simply need to reach out using our kitchen pail and place that compost, that rich compost that we can take a handful of back onto the soil and move forward. It does feel, it's the kind of thing that gives me hope. At the same time, I struggle with how difficult it seems to be. And I have to say that Anthony is an example of the kind of incredible creative energy that I think lives in all of us to craft a new solution to get to a stable climate and a more stable future. I'll stop there, and then we have all kinds of answers if you have any technical questions about how to actually implement a program like this in your town or your county or your state. And that's really what I feel like I'm at the department to do, and the rest of the department is there to support you. Let me stop there. Thanks.
Awesome, Kevin. Thank you so much for sharing the San Francisco story. We continue to be so inspired by the city and your work every day. I'd like to introduce everyone to Cala Ostrinder, who we're really lucky to have today. She is a strategic advisor to communities, individuals, institutions, and governments. Very excited to hear about her work and the tools that she's been working on to make it easy for communities to really take on this work and really implement change. So thank you so much, Cala.
Thank you, Ruth. And thank you to Corinne for telling us, sharing with us the land blessing and land acknowledgement and the work that you all are doing in West Oakland. I'm really excited to see that happening, and it fills my heart with a lot of gratitude and hope to see that. So thank you for sharing that with all of us. I'm going to tell you today about some tools that communities can use to help plan with their governments, businesses, and community members who may not traditionally be included in the planning process, how to use this incredible resource of organic materials for climate action, but also for community development and supporting of local food and regenerative agriculture. So I'm going to share my screen with you all, and we'll go from there. There's a couple things that I wanted to address real quick as I'm getting this set up. The first one is something that Anthony brought up about the facilities needed for composting under this Bill 1383, SB 1383. And the reality is that while the state says we need 90 new facilities, there are fewer than 10 going through the permitting process right now. And the state is in no way guaranteeing that those facilities will be created. In fact, what we're seeing is a lot of applications for very, very large anaerobic digesters or waste to power projects, which are not compost facilities. So Kevin's point about local action and actively voicing where you want those organic materials to go and how you want them to be used is really the point I'm going to talk about today. And in this presentation about redesigning municipal organic material systems for climate and community resilience and equitable economic diversification. I should note that this project was funded by the Urban Sustainability Directors Network and was really championed by the City and County of San Francisco, though we had cities across the country, including Fayetteville, Cleveland, San Luis Obispo, and Boulder participating in our core study. Here's some of the authors that contributed to this project. I'm really proud to have had Courtney Brown from the California Alliance for Community Composting and Lynn Fang from LA Compost, Dan Match from EcoCycle in Boulder as reviewers on this project, and was excited to also work with the Colorado State University team who created that tool that was mentioned, Comet Planner, which helps estimate carbon sequestration from these practices. Also, really, again, shout out to San Francisco for continuing to lead all of this work and donating their resources to help others, maybe with fewer resources, take a look at the work they've done and do it in their own ways. So I just want to remind everybody that carbon is not just a pollutant, it is a keystone in our system. It is the organizing principle of our life cycle. I'm really glad that we were opened up with Indigenous wisdom. I think we really have a lot to learn from the Indigenous communities and their traditional knowledge in understanding things in cycles, not in linear, not in buckets, but really in the way that carbon helps bring together and organize all of the physical, chemical, and biological processes on our planet. If we can start looking at carbon as an organizing principle and as energy that attracts other energy, I think we will really change the paradigm of climate change and also maybe change our paradigm for dealing with each other and being in coexistence. Carbon is a keystone in the system, and water follows carbon. So because carbon is an organizing principle for life on our planet, it's this really beautiful element. And where we see more carbon, we see more water. So we have these really extreme weather events, right? And those are in large part caused by there being more water in the atmosphere. There's more water in the atmosphere because there's more heat in the atmosphere, and that heat is caused by more carbon. Likewise, when we put more carbon in the soil, we get more water in the soil. For those of us who live in the Western United States, which all of us do, probably about 60% of our precip comes from the small water cycle. Small water cycles are driven by plants, trees that call in moisture from the ocean, like the redwoods, grasses that bring that moisture further inland to the farming regions of California, and then the mountains and trees that continue to draw that moisture inward to where I live up in Colorado. So we need to really start thinking about how carbon drives and sort of encourages and invites water to come back into the landscape in more balanced ways. The beautiful thing too here is once you have more carbon and more water in the soil, you also get more nutrients. And that means more naturally available nutrients. You start to return the fertility to the soil, and something beautiful happens. You get a change in the electromagnetic capacity of the soil. So the cation exchange capacity changes, and all of a sudden, the soil starts to hold on to more nutrients. It starts to make more nutrients available. And the mycorrhizal fungi and other soil life start to enhance that web in creating fertility and bringing life back into the soil. So again, if you start to see that carbon, when returned to the ground, when returned to plants, brings water, and then carbon and water bring nutrients and life, you start to understand that we're not just talking about greenhouse gas emissions, we're talking about supporting the life cycles of our planet. So again, we're trying to look at these practices that create a net carbon gain in our soil. This process guide that we created for the USDN and which we'll share with you today is bridging from a Kyoto-based framework. And for those climate wonks, you'll know that the Kyoto Protocol is what created the type of climate policy we have today to a carbon cycle-based framework. So we're not just looking at pollutants from point sources like tailpipes and factories, although it is critical that we reduce those pollutants. It's essential we reduce them. But we're also wanting to look at carbon again, not as just a pollutant, but as a driving force to help us rebalance the energy and the climate of our planet. So there are some climate benefits that we can account for under a Kyoto program, and there's some we don't have a calculator for. For example, in our climate action plans in cities right now, we may have a way to calculate carbon, but we don't have a way to calculate the water benefits of that carbon, the nutrient benefits of that carbon. But we know from science that they are very real. So this process guide is here to help us reduce the floods and droughts and fires, to replenish our water sources and cycles, and to Anthony's point, to restore fertility and human health in our systems. Again, our climate inventories in cities generally look at direct emissions from fossil fuels. What this guide does is it starts to help us look at the benefits climate-wise and community-wise of sequestering carbon through the way we manage our plants and our soils and our agriculture and our organic materials. So we really want to increase those carbon stocks in our cities, in our yards, and our surrounding farms and forests. Again, this is moving from a point source pollutant framework into these large biogeochemical cycles, these cycles that drive and support life on our planet. Our process guide is a template for co-creation or co-care of our living systems, and it's starting with the organic materials. The process guide is meant to be used by cities and communities together to help understand the resource that organic materials offer and to co-decide what to do with it. So it has 6 steps in this process guide, and you can really start anywhere. I'm going to share the link afterwards, and anyone can download the process guide itself and the companion spreadsheets. But this is a very practical way to get everybody together to look at this resource and how you're going to manage it as a community. The first step is to take your organic materials, types, and volumes and understand, where is this resource coming from grocery stores, from residential stores, farmers markets? Where do you have yard waste? Do you have manures or even biosolids that may support more compost production in and around your community? It also helps you look at who's generating these materials, where are they coming from, and how are they currently being processed? Are they going to landfill? Are they going to a digester? And where would you want to process them differently? The second question asks that, helps you expand on that. So where are your current materials going? How are they being processed? And what type of capacity do you have at those facilities? Again, Anthony mentioned 90 facilities. That's how many facilities we need. In reality, we have less than 10 that are being permitted right now. So when we start to take a look at all that organic material and where it's going, we start to see that we need new facilities, new ways of processing that. This guide helps identify internal teams to cities and community stakeholders and helps people understand maybe who folks are in those different areas that they don't know about, who to reach out to, and how to create groups of people that can co-create this process, this planning process. It helps identify related needs. Maybe your community has a climate resilience goal or a climate emergency plan. Maybe it has a food security goal. Maybe you want to look at where the community can reduce flooding by installing more wetlands or taking water out of hard paved infrastructure and putting it back into natural infrastructure. So there's a step in the process guide that helps you identify where there are intersecting plans, policies, and goals that your city or county may already have, and how you can bring those to bear to support this activity that you're doing. Step 5 is about imagining a new design together. And this means, okay, we know where all our materials are coming from. We know where they're going right now. We know what all of our intersectional goals are around restoring land, creating spaces for food or community, supporting regenerative agriculture, or building gardens, whatever that may be in your community. You've done that work. So now you can sit down with your city, or the city can sit down with its community and say, how do we want to redesign this system? Because we're at a point where we get to build a whole new system as a society, and that system is how we take what we call waste and return it into life, and that we do so in a way that supports our carbon cycle and our community health. We created a tool that helps you identify the carbon benefits that science has peer-reviewed and published papers on. It's from the US EPA, USDA, and the IPCC. That tool is only available right now to select cities, but we hope it will become available to all cities in California, so you can calculate the greenhouse gas benefits associated with your activities. We also want you to take the time to speak with community members, scientists, indigenous and tribal folks in your communities who might be able to articulate other benefits than just beside those greenhouse gas sequestration benefits. They all matter, and it's important we start articulating them together. Again, the process guide has 6 sections, and it's possible to do any section at one time. It's possible that your city or county or community may have already done parts of these, and it's just about bringing them all together so that you can reimagine this process together. I'm not going to show you the tool today just for the sake of time, but I will provide Ruth with the links to both the tool and the process guide in the companion spreadsheets. And again, we really urge you, if you are a city that's looking at your organic materials and maybe considering putting in new community composting in your city, or supporting a compost facility in your neighboring region so more agriculture can get compost, we encourage you to go through this process, or at least take a cue from this process, because the state is not going to build those facilities. Communities need to say how they want to build those facilities and how much they want to go to community composting, on-farm composting, or commercial composting. This resource is uniquely in the care of communities and uniquely in the jurisdiction of communities. So I would really encourage all of you to participate in this in one way or another. The last thing I would say is there's going to be a measure on next year's ballot. So in the fall of next year, there's going to be a measure that would place a 0.5 penny to 1 penny tax on disposable plastics, single-use items. So those water bottles, packaging that's a single-use plastic disposable. And that tax would create a pool of funding, which would be dedicated to building new compost and recycling facilities. And specifically, 30% of all of the funds would be earmarked for communities that have suffered from historical environmental injustice and are climate vulnerable. That is estimated to bring in $2 to $4 billion a year. So if we think about that funding source, I would encourage you all to start thinking about how to organize around that ballot initiative next year, because it would be a massive change in our community's ability to access the resources to support both green spaces and composting within their communities. I will leave it there, and it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
Beautifully done, Cala Rose. It was 20 pounds of sugar in a 1 pound sack. I really appreciate your going through all of that for us. And we will be sending out all of these resources, including Cala Rose's presentations. So in case that was a little small for everybody to see, so that you can really appreciate all the work that's being done on this process. Because we're running a little bit long, I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Elaine, who's going to give us the Mentimeter, but you can continue to ask your questions in the chat, and I will ask Anthony, Kevin, and Cala Rose to respond. And thank you so much to our panel. You guys were amazing.
Okay, thanks so much, Ruth, and thank you all to our panelists for that wonderful discussion. Now we're going to move on to something just a little fun and to hear from our audience. And we're going to use a tool called Mentimeter. We've used it before in the summits, so it may be familiar to some of you. And we want to ask you all, in regards to the ecological protection that we're talking about today, we want to pose a question to you. And that is, what are the top priorities for ecological protection you would like your local government to implement? And we're going to be talking a little bit more about some others later on, but let's just think kind of broadly. And I am going to put in the chat for everyone the link to the Mentimeter. So you can find that in the chat, and you can actually type in a couple of different options. I think we give you 3. And you can type them into the Mentimeter, and then we are going to see them. One moment. Let's see, hold on 1 second. Yeah, we're going to see them on there as you populate. So I hope that you all can go to the link and type in your suggestions on what you think your local government should be doing to protect our ecosystems. And we're going to take a moment and see what you all suggest to us. And this is fabulous. Composting, we just talked a lot about that. Fire management, community gardens, couple about community gardens. Single-use plastic ban, which we've seen in a couple of Bay Area cities, but we need more of that. Reforestation, protecting our forests. Wow, this just keeps growing. Habitat preservation. I see several waste things like, ooh, it's bouncing around so much. Not just single-use plastics, but reusable packaging. Yeah, we I think need a whole summit to talk a lot more about waste And of course, there's other organizations in the state and in the Bay Area that work on waste specifically. Soil restoration, water. Oh yeah, water is a huge one as we all go into the drought or continue the drought, depending on how you look at it. Okay, this is fabulous. I think I might even, continue populating this. We might revisit this on our break after the next panel discussion, but thank you all for your contributions. Keep them coming. And we are going to look at this actually. All the information that you provide feedback on, you, the summit participants, we from the CEMTF, from the task force and the steering committee, continue to look at the information that you provide to us, and we continuously use it for all of our activities and events. So thank you so much for all of that. And Amos, you're up.
Thank you, Elaine, and thank you, Ruth, for a brilliant panel of speakers. I was taking notes feverishly, and then I remember we're recording this, so thank you. Next up, we have our second panel on forest and land management for climate protection. Elaine's going to facilitate this one with speakers Chad Hansen of the John Muir Project, Maya Kosla, who's a biologist, and Gary Hughes of Biofuel Watch. Elaine?
Yes, thank you so much. So, so this panel is really made up of ecologists and climate activists, and they're going to talk about the vital role of forest ecosystems in climate protection while debunking the myths of current forest management practices. And our panelists are going to really try to discuss the real existential threats to our California forests that we all in the Bay Area, and talk about what we all in the Bay Area not only can do about it, but really must take active roles in addressing. The terrestrial ecosystem stores almost 3 times the amount of carbon found in the ecosystem in the atmosphere. So I think we all recognize just how critically important this is in the climate emergency. And with that, I'm going to just kind of briefly introduce our speakers. Our first speaker is Gary Hughes. He works with the international organization Biofuel Watch on a portfolio of forest, climate, and energy sector issues, both domestically and internationally. He represents Biofuel Watch through numerous coalitions and networks, including Stay Grounded Network for a Just Transition, the Global Forest Coalition, and on the steering committee of the Hands Off Mother Earth. And then Gary will be followed by Dr. Chad Hansen, who's a research ecologist and the director of the John Muir Project at Earth Island Institute. Dr. Hansen earned a PhD in ecology from UC Davis with a research focus on fire ecology and conifer forest ecosystems. He's the author of the 2021 book, Smokescreen: Debunking Wildfire Myths to Save Our Forests and Our Climate, which is foundational to our discussion today. And he's published dozens of scientific articles and studies in peer-reviewed journals on forest and fire ecology and climate change. And then finally, Maya Kosla is a biologist and writer. She's currently working on a film about how to be fire-wise. She's authored numerous award-winning books on poetry, and the Sonoma County Conservation Council selected Maya as one of the 2020 Environmentalists of the Year. Today, she's going to talk about her on-the-ground work on forest protection, and particularly in Sonoma County. So with that, I'd like to hand the floor over to our first speaker, Gary Hughes.
All right, thank you so much, Elaine. I really do want to share with everyone how much of an honor it is to be here as a part of this community. And I've got just a short selection of slides that I'm hoping are visible to everyone. And I'm just going to try to set the stage then for this discussion that Maya and Chad will continue. I have a couple of goals with my slides with the audience right here that I really hope people will take home. And number one is this, understanding that there's a crisis of forest governance in California's forests, but in particular, I'm going to focus on the redwoods because the redwoods are globally important. These are potentially one of the most carbon dense ecosystems in the world, and certainly in California by far amongst the most important. But one of the issues that we're dealing with is corporate capture of our agencies. And I speak specifically of the California Air Resources Board, the California Natural Resources Agency, and the California Department of Forestry and Fire Protection, which people know as CAL FIRE. So I've got just a few slides here that I'm gonna use some mapping, some images, and try to drive home the reality on the ground in the redwoods that's being obfuscated, frankly, by a great deal of the climate discourse coming from the state government around, for instance, nature-based solutions. So we'll move on here to my next slide, which is just a little bit of an introduction to Biofuel Watch. We do have a really strong focus on bioenergy. And of course, this community, it's such an honor to be here because I was here previously in the summer where I focused more specifically on the issues of the proposed conversion of refineries here in the Bay Area to largely soy-based renewable diesel and sustainable aviation fuel. But within the portfolio work that I do, there's a lot of focus on what's happening with the land sector in terms of climate, and certainly the protection of our forest is central to that. It was mentioned that I'm a member through Biofuel Watch of the Global Forest Coalition. A Global Forest Coalition is a network of more than 100 indigenous and community-based organizations in 60 countries around the world. And just really want to put forth to folks here that many times the compromises that we're willing to make in California, where we acquiesce and decide that we're willing to settle for some climate policy, and maybe it's not perfect, but we can live with it. Those policies are weaponized around the world, and we can see now that climate policy really is increasingly becoming a tool for the extension of imperial hegemony, and it specifically manifests itself in the form of carbon markets, and unfortunately more and more focus on geoengineering. And so again, this idea of nature-based solutions, we're working with communities around the world that are saying, hey, wait a second, our nature is not your solution. So that's the frame that I bring to this work. Also really want to emphasize, I think this is a slide that I shared in the summer, is to understand the kind of climate disinformation, the misinformation, the confusion that's being planted literally by extractive industry. And this goes for as much for the timber industry, for the woods product industry, as it is with the fossil fuel industry. And I'm going to drive this home then here with some images to really show that our forests are, as Elaine said, facing an existential threat. Yet nevertheless, over the last 10 years, especially because of the bursting on the scene of markets-based mechanisms here in California, the timber industry has been able to present itself as a climate solution. But let's be frank, they're really putting our future at risk. For whatever reason, there we go. And thank you for your patience with any glitches. Our redwoods are being clear cut massively on short rotations. This is potentially one of the most carbon dense forest ecosystems on the planet, but they're being subject to intensive industrial extraction, and worse, they're being certified sustainable by some of the leading certification schemes on the planet. So this is a photo of Green Diamond Resource Company's certified FSC sustainable, the Forest Stewardship Council. To drill in then on this a little bit more, just some mapping really quick, just easy stuff from Google Earth. Here's a shot of Humboldt County. You can see the lines of the county. And then I've got this little arrow, this target right here. Just north of that target is the Redwood State and National Parks Complex. So this is all protected land, but around it, if you can follow my cursors, heavily managed industrial lands. And we'll come in a little bit further on this. This is Humboldt County. This is the Redwoods. If I didn't tell you this, you might see this image and you'd be thinking this is Indonesia, this is the Amazon, this is Africa. But no, this is what is happening with California's forests, where the logging is being carried up right to the edge of globally important protected areas to recognize that there's 2 United Nations recognized World Heritage Sites in the state of California. One is Yosemite and the other one is Redwood National Park. But as we can see, the buffer zone of this, biosphere reserve is being hammered by industrial activity. This is a photo from a flight, an overflight in summer of 2020. You can see everyone was talking about soil and how there is so much carbon sequestration potential in soil. Yet here in California, our forests are being damaged to the extent that the soil is just exposed to the sky. You can see it from satellites in the earth. And there's nothing about this that is climate friendly. Nevertheless, it's not getting any scrutiny by the public, much less our state agencies, which are the ones who are facilitating this kind of destruction. And we call it destruction, again, to be very cautious about certification schemes right now. I've worked around the Forest Stewardship Council certification scheme for 25 years since it first arrived. I worked internationally and here in California, and it's failing on many fronts. This Greenpeace study identified a long list of certification schemes on palm, on bioenergy, on soy, and also on forests with the Forest Stewardship Council. And these are all certification schemes. When you see the brand, you should be very skeptical. And both Humboldt Redwood Company and Mendocino Redwood Company, as well as Green Diamond Redwood Company, are all certified sustainable by FSC, but we can have no confidence whatsoever in that certification scheme right now. And as a case in point, then I want to show you a couple of images from a mapping site, forestobservatory.org. Check it out. But this image is from 2016, and these are Green Diamond Holdings certified FSC sustainable, this time just to the north of the Redwood National and State Parks. And in the space of 5 years, you can see exactly how intense the logging was in this area. Now, this is not old growth forest that Green Diamond is logging. This is second growth forest. This is recovering redwood. Nevertheless, it's right in what could be considered the buffer zone of this globally important protected area. Out of sight, out of mind, super intensive logging happening here in the state of California, permitted by state authorities and certified sustainable, yet absolutely detrimental to achieving any of the climate goals that the state is so eager to convince the public are a priority. So let's look at this once again, 2016, 2020, very damaging, very serious stuff going on in our forests. Another really gross example, 2019, was the logging of the old growth and Rainbow Ridge. This was an iconic place back in the 1990s. It was a site of an ongoing occupation to protect the logging of this forest by Pacific Lumber Company. It was central to the so-called timber wars. Yet this logging happened in the summer of 2019, permitted by the state authorities. And not only that, Robert Fisher of the Gap Empire, whose family owns Humboldt Redwood Company and Mendocino Redwood Company. Robert Fisher is also on the board of the organization Conservation International, as well as an honorary trustee of the Natural Resources Defense Council. This logging was certified sustainable by FSC. There was massive protest by the local people. It didn't get any state coverage. The logging went ahead anyhow, and the state permitted it. The thing is they're logging old growth forest. You would think, well, okay, at least the state is recognizing what kind of climate damage is happening from this logging. But the real truth of it is that when it comes to timber extraction in the state of California, responsible authorities like the Air Resources Board still provide no data whatsoever on the greenhouse gas emissions from this type of human economic activity. This is an example right here from the emissions inventory from the Air Resources Board. They had a little tool where you could do some graphing with the emissions, and you can see they have no data on the greenhouse gas emissions from forest management. This is indicative of what we call a crisis in forest governance. Another case then, to really get close to wrapping it up, really wanting people to get involved. If you feel like you want to get involved with changing the course of travel on which we have embarked with this intensive management for extracting wood products from our landscape, what is going on with the Jackson Demonstration State Forest in Western Mendocino County is a fantastic opportunity to support a community that is trying to stop the logging of land that belongs to us. So Jackson Demonstration State Forest is one of about 8 publicly owned, state-owned forests in the state. It is the largest. And by this map, though, you can see that the purple are approved timber harvest plans. The yellow are timber harvest plans that have already been implemented in the last 25 years. The red are the new proposed timber harvest plans. And if you look then in the context of this, all of these mapped colors, the tan color, this is all logging that has occurred in the last 25 years. So what we are finding across the redwood region is that if it's common knowledge that only 3 to 5% of the old growth remains in disparate patches spread across the whole region, what is less known is that the true second growth forest, that is that forest that has only been logged once, is now even summing a total that's less than how much old growth is left. And so the point being then that more than 90% of the redwoods have been logged at least twice, if not 3 or 4 times. This needs to change in our state. So the Mendocino Trail Stewards.org, if you drop into that website, they've got all sorts of ways to get involved in weighing in on these timber harvest plans and really trying to change the direction of management with Jackson Forests, and also elevating, again, Pomo people, coastal Yuki. These are traditional lands, territory of indigenous people who since time immemorial have been caring for these landscapes. So this is a great window, a great way to get involved. Another thing I'd like to draw people's attention to that is a growing understanding that the California Department of Forestry and Fire Protection may be a fantastic firefighting entity. And at the same time, they're and have totally failed on their responsibilities for stewarding our forests for the future generations. And this is why there's a growing demand for massive reform of our management agencies in the state. And we'd like to see a total separation, as it were, between the firefighting responsibilities of CAL FIRE and the forest management responsibilities of the California Department of Forestry. Here's a paper that you can check out to learn more about this. I'm not saying that this paper 100% paves the road forward, but it's a really good resource. I'm pretty much there now. I tried to be as quick as possible, really respecting all of the phenomenal information that we're hearing from so many people today. There's some information here about how to get a hold of me if people want to reach out or learn more about the work that we're doing. Again, I'm really honored to be a part of this community and to be contributing to this discussion. And I think now I turn it back over to Elaine, and she can hand it on to whoever is next of Chad and Maya. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Gary. And I don't think anything needs to be said except to introduce Dr. Hansen and invite him to continue this conversation.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. I'm Dr. Chad Hansen, a forest and fire ecologist with the John Muir Project. I'm going to share my screen now. Good. Well, so I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the importance, first of all, of protecting forests in order to mitigate the climate crisis, and some of the euphemisms that are out there that sound like good things, but are actually, in fact, bad things that are harming the climate, harming biodiversity, and harming communities. And also just, some of the science that's emerging, which I believe, and I hope you'll agree, is fundamentally good news, because it points to, I think, a very hopeful path forward, so long as we understand, some of the myths and misconceptions that, as I argue in my book, are a smokescreen that are getting in the way of progress. I came out with my book earlier this year in late May, Smokescreen, Debunking Wildfire Myths to Save Our Forests and Our Climate. And of course, I have a lot more information in the book, and hundreds of scientific studies cited in the endnotes, but I did write it for a general public audience. I did not write this just for scientists. I wanted everyone, this to be accessible to everybody. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is a key thing that a lot of people are very, very justifiably concerned about, which is how do we protect communities from wildfire? Because we are seeing every single fire season, communities being impacted, homes being lost, lives being lost, and the fact is, the science is very clear now that this is almost entirely preventable if we focus our attention and our resources on the communities themselves. And that's where we need to go. Unfortunately, that's not what's happening currently. The vast majority of our fire management resources are being focused on backcountry logging and backcountry fire suppression, which is not helping, and it's making things worse. So just very briefly, I just wanted to point out that the science is telling us that the only effective way to protect homes from wildfire is to focus on home hardening, which is basically just making the homes themselves more fire resistant. Things like ember-proof vents to prevent embers from being driven by the winds into exterior vents, rain gutter guards to keep the embers from igniting pine needles and leaves in the rain gutters, and defensible space pruning, just pruning of vegetation within 100 feet of homes, mostly dry grasses and pine needles and twigs or other leaves on the ground, and removing lower limbs on mature trees. But you don't need to cut the mature trees down. That's highly effective. Now, when the other approach is done, the current approach, basically logging operations kind of euphemistically under the guise of fuel reduction out in the forest. Commercial thinning is an example. Post-fire logging is another example. These are all logging operations, intensive logging that's conducted under the guise of fuel reduction. This is what the approach was in the decade and more prior to the campfire of 2018. And that's what the campfire burned through, several thousand acres of that logging in the first 6 hours before devastating the town of Paradise. Over 14,000 homes were lost and over 86 lives were lost. So the tragedy there was a human tragedy. And that was avoidable because if we had done the home hardening, if we had done the evacuation assistance, the defensible space, if we had focused on the community itself and provided that assistance, especially for people that can't afford it themselves, what we're seeing in example after example is where that's done, we're seeing over 99% of homes survive frequently and everyone gets out safely. Conversely, again, back to the current approach, which is backcountry logging and backcountry fire suppression, it has been proven to be completely ineffective in fire season after fire season. This is an image showing the Caldor fire, which is burning right now. It's mostly out at this point, but it's been burning for the last several weeks in the central Sierra Nevada. And those yellow and orange areas, that's all previous logging. Most of that's commercial thinning, a lot of it on public lands. And the fire just burned right through that, oftentimes more rapidly and more intensely through those thinned areas and other logging than through denser mature forests. And in fact, in that kind of southwestern portion of the fire, you can see the little community of Grizzly Flats. There was a large commercial thinning project proposed on the El Dorado National Forest that we opposed. Forest Service went ahead with it, called the Trestle Logging Project, under the guise of commercial thinning. The fire burned very, very rapidly and intensely through that, and now most of Grizzly Flats is gone. Same thing in the current Dixie fire. It's a 2021 fire, large fire, which you get large fires in big drought years, especially when you have hot, dry, windy conditions. And again, you can see all those yellow and orange and red areas. As this is past management, yellow and orange, all past logging and mostly commercial thinning. And the fire is burning right through these areas. Again, oftentimes most rapidly and most intensely than any place in the fire. Right in the center of the fire is the little community of Greenville, a place I know well. The fire burned through thousands of acres that had been commercially thinned under the guise of community protection, burned through those thousands of acres very rapidly and burned down most of the town of Greenville. That happened this summer. Again, this is avoidable. And I mentioned all this from the outset because this logging is being done on millions of acres out in wildlands across the West, and in some cases in the East as well, ostensibly to protect communities from wildfire. So first of all, it's not doing that. It's actually having the opposite effect. Oftentimes the fires are burning faster and more intensely through the logged areas toward the towns, but it's also pulling massive amounts of carbon out of our forests and putting most of that into the atmosphere. And that's what I'll focus on for the remainder of my talk. So we know that we from the scientific consensus now from climate scientists nationally and globally, we know we have to get away from fossil fuels as quickly as possible. We also know that that's not enough because once we put all that excess carbon in the atmosphere through fossil fuel consumption and logging, it stays up there for a very, very long time. It's what we call CO2 residence time. And so we have to draw it down. There are a lot of false solutions out there like carbon capture and storage and biomass energy and carbon capture and storage. These do not work. They actually increase emissions. They have all kinds of problems, major environmental justice problems as well, which we can talk about a little bit more in the Q&A if people are interested. But the solution is not to build thousands of miles of CO2 pipelines and pump CO2 underground. We're going to have to do the rest by protecting natural ecosystems. And true nature-based climate solutions means protecting ecosystems from resource extraction, from carbon removal, not removing carbon. So we know it's a necessity to do this, to draw down atmospheric carbon. And in fact, forest protection can be as much as half of needed climate change mitigation globally. And the US can play a huge role in that. But we have to get around and get through these harmful myths. So I'm going to focus on a few of those here. First one is the myth of overgrown forests. And I'm sure we've all heard this many, many times, this idea that, well, we have way too much carbon in our forests, way too much biomass, too many trees. And that's why the fires are burning so intensely. That's how the narrative goes. This narrative is being spun by the logging industry, by the US Forest Service, which is in the commercial logging business, and by CAL FIRE, which is also very much in the business of logging. Science is telling us something very, very different. First of all, in every forested region of the United States, we have much less carbon in our forests than their biological potential would indicate. And that's just due because of many decades of carbon removal from logging. And so contrary to this narrative that's being put out there that our forests just have too much biomass, too much carbon in them, they actually have considerably less in most areas, the vast majority of areas, than they did historically. It also means that our current levels of carbon storage in our forests, because they're much lower than their biological potential, we have huge climate change mitigation potential if we protect our forests and start consuming less wood and protecting more forests and moving away from logging and starting that process over time. So there's lots of science on this. We've looked at this again and again, different groups of scientists, myself included. And we found that forests that are denser, that have more biomass, more carbon, they actually burn less intensely most of the time. This is an image from Zalden Dunn 2018, but similar findings are in many other studies. I've listed just a few there, also on the screen in the lower left. But basically, as you see here, as biomass goes up, as carbon storage goes up in forests, the fire intensity, which is that black line in the center of the figure, that tends to go down overall. Interestingly, in similar fashion, lots of studies have looked at whether fires burn more intensely if they haven't burned in a very long time. And what we're finding, and this is my research as well as others, is that forests that haven't burned in many decades actually burn less intensely most of the time, or they have similar intensities. But we're finding again and again and again that this idea that somehow if forests haven't burned in many decades, which is true for many forests, that they're going to burn necessarily at high intensity if a fire occurs, that's just absolutely not true. They're burning mostly at low and moderate, which are those light and medium grade bars. And only a small portion burns at high intensity, which are those black bars at the bottom. And in fact, the forests that haven't burned in the longest period of time, like more than 75 years or even a century since the last fire, they have some of the lowest levels of high intensity fire. Now, why is that? It really comes down to a few key things. First of all, forest fires are driven overwhelmingly by weather and climate factors, not by how dense a forest is. But interestingly, forest density is a factor, but it's a secondary factor. And it really comes down to microclimate. A denser forest has more cooling shade of the forest canopy, has higher canopy cover because there's more trees and more mature trees. And that higher canopy cover creates a cooler, moister microclimate that allows the forest to stay more cool and more moist in fire season. Denser forests also act as a windbreak, a buffer against the winds that drive flames in a forest fire. Now, conversely, when logging occurs, including commercial thinning, it reduces the forest canopy cover. It creates hotter, drier, and windier conditions. And it logging equipment spreads highly combustible invasive grasses like cheatgrass. And this was the finding in a study that I co-authored, Bradley et al. 2016. It's the largest scientific analysis ever done on this question in the US. Looked at the whole Western US, 3 decades of data. And we found that forests with the fewest environmental protections and the most logging actually had the most intense fires, whereas forests with higher levels of protection and little or no logging had the lower and lowest levels of fire intensity. Now, of course, fires are highly variable. You can have areas that burn at lower intensity in a thinned area, but more often, thinned areas burn at higher intensity. And this is another study. It just shows that. The bars going to the right are higher intensity. The ones that go to the left are lower intensity. And these are just kind of different weather scenarios and different combinations of conditions. And so, yes, sometimes a thinned area will burn at low intensity. That happens. Forest Service and Cal Fire and the logging industry have been cherry picking those locations to show to the public and reporters for years. But whenever we look at all of the data in these larger fires, we find that the areas where these thinnings occur, they burn at higher intensity most of the time, equal or higher intensity. It's also not true that dead trees are driving fire. That's another myth. Forests with more dead trees do not burn more intensely. This has been studied again and again, and the overwhelming weight of science indicates that forests with more dead trees burn at equal or lower intensities. And this is one of those studies. Even 20, 25 years after the trees die in a given area, the fire burns at lower intensity. And that's what that graph, that trajectory is showing, lower intensity in wildfires with even more years after the trees die. And the reason is simple. When trees die, needles and small twigs quickly fall and decay into soil. And there's just not much to carry flames. There's not much kindling in those trees. And then when they fall years later, they soak up and retain large amounts of soil moisture, like big sponges. Then I'll just spend a few minutes briefly talking about the other key myth, which is what I call the catastrophic wildfire myth. And that's this idea that somehow we must log our forests to save them from wildfire because wildfire is destroying the forests. Well, as I mentioned, logging is not curbing fires, it's doing the opposite. But also, fire is not destroying our forests. In fact, even in the biggest fires, they're mostly low and moderate intensity. This is the Rim Fire, 257,000 acres that burned 8 years ago. Those red areas are high intensity fire patches. It's only 19.9% of the fire. 80% of the fire is the green and yellow, and that's low and moderate, where most of the trees survive, including many of the small trees. The Wallow Fire of 2011, the red is only 9%, so 91% low and moderate intensity. This is a 565,000 acre fire. So just because a fire is bigger doesn't mean it burns more intensely. It actually means the opposite oftentimes. Historically, even in mixed conifer forests and ponderosa pine forests, before fire suppression, high intensity fire is a natural component in these forests, has been for millions of years. And it typically comprised, before fire suppression, 20 to 35% of a given fire. So we don't want it to be the majority. That wouldn't be natural. But we also shouldn't worry if we see a fire that has a component that's a third or a quarter high intensity fire. It turns out not only is that natural, but it's incredibly ecologically important. Those patches where fire burns intensely and kills most or all the trees, it creates a unique habitat type that we call snag forest habitat. And snag forest habitat is incredibly important. It's actually comparable to old growth forest in terms of native biodiversity and wildlife abundance. Many different native insect species depend on fire-killed trees to reproduce. Many native woodpecker species depend on the larvae of those insects for their food source. Woodpeckers need the dead trees because they're softer than live trees and they can excavate nest cavities. And all the nest cavities that the woodpeckers excavate every year, multiple ones every year, are available and create cavities and habitat for all the other dozens of cavity nesting species in the forest that have to have cavities to raise their young and reproduce, but can't create their own, like bluebirds and nuthatches, flying squirrels, chipmunks, dozens and dozens of native species that have to have the woodpeckers to create those cavities for them. So this is a rich, interconnected ecosystem that's actually created, habitat created by fire, not habitat destroyed or lost. In fact, overall bird abundance and diversity oftentimes goes up with fire intensity. You don't want everything to burn at high intensity because other species like and need forests that burn at lower intensities. But you want that to be a significant part of the mix because a lot of species depend on that habitat. We actually have less wildfire now than we had historically in our forests. That's really important to realize. We have a lot more than we had in the 1970s and 1980s. That's true. But we have considerably less than we had in the 1870s and 1880s. And that's really the baseline that matters, is the ecological baseline before fire suppression, not the 1970s or 1980s. Interestingly, even in a high intensity fire patch, fire consumes only about 3% or less of the tree carbon. Oftentimes less than 1% of the tree carbon is consumed. And so the current fire models are vastly overstating carbon emissions from wildfires because they're making assumptions that are contradicted by the field-based data. They oftentimes assume that 10% or 30% or 50% of the tree carbon is consumed. And that's been debunked over and over and over again by the data. Also, none of the current fire models take into account post-fire regrowth. And of course, forests regrow naturally and regenerate wonderfully right after the fire. And as they're doing that, they're pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere and sequestering and storing it in the growing forest. And this is just one example. This is common natural post-fire regeneration. This is a large high-intensity fire patch in the rimfire. Forests do not need to be artificially planted with trees after fire. They do not need reforestation. And in fact, reforestation is a term that we need to be careful of because it's often being abused. It's just a smokescreen for clear cutting and in industrial tree plantations. This is what happens in a forest if you just leave it alone after a fire. This is me and Dr. James Hansen, the world famous climate scientist. He and I and others are trying to stop a large post-fire clear cutting project on national forest lands in the rimfire that's being subsidized with taxpayer money. And the Forest Service is claiming that the forest is not regenerating, but this is actually what it looks like. Right next door, this is Dr. Hansen and I, the other Dr. Hansen and I, standing just a couple hundred meters away in an area that was post-fire logged and artificially planted under the guise of restoration and reforestation. And as you can see, most of the trees they planted died. Some survived and they're struggling to live and grow. But there was so much damage from the logging, soil compaction, nutrient removal, and also the logging actually rolls over, the logging equipment rolls over and kills nearly all of the natural forest regeneration that was growing in before the logging happened. And so, point is we need to let our, trust nature and let our forests naturally regenerate after fires. Here's another example. This is just pretty typical natural forest regeneration, way in the middle of one of the largest high intensity fire patches in the rimfire. No artificial planting, no anything. And wonderful, abundant regeneration, lots of carbon sequestration there. But right next door, where the post-fire logging happened, again, you have an area that has just been devastated, and where the carbon was removed, and most of that's in the atmosphere now. And this is also true in giant sequoia ecosystems. Giant sequoias regenerate wonderfully after fire, including where it burns intensely, especially where it burns more intensely. These are all giant sequoia seedlings and saplings in an area that burned 4 years ago in the railroad fire in the Nelder Grove. And so we don't need to fear that giant sequoias won't regenerate. In fact, the thing that helps them regenerate best is fire. Now, because of all that regeneration, our forests become a carbon sink again within a very short period of time, usually less than a decade after a fire, because of the nutrient cycling from the fire, and because of all the vigorous post-fire natural regrowth that is spurred and enhanced by the fire. Lots of studies on this. But even though our forests continue to be a carbon sink, even areas that have significant logging, they could be a much bigger carbon sink if we moved away from logging and stopped consuming so much wood and protected a lot more of our forests on both public and private lands, which is where we need to go. One of the big threats right now is what we call biomass logging. Basically, when trees are removed from forests and whole trees or portions of trees are being incinerated for energy production. And that actually produces more CO2 than burning coal for equal energy produced. And so it's even worse for the climate than coal, which is really hard to do. So we cannot turn to our forests as an energy source and incinerate them for biomass. That's what this looks like. This is an area that was where biomass logging occurred on public lands in the rimfire. This is one of those units we were trying to stop. And we're calling this clear cuts for kilowatts. It is a climate change nightmare, and it's something we really need to be careful of and really protect our forests and get the Forest Service out of the commercial logging business. This is commercial thinning. A lot of people don't realize thinning seems like a benign sounding term. It is not in practice. 95+% of the time on national forests and also on private lands, when they say thinning, it's an industrial logging operation that kills and removes upwards of 70% of the trees, and oftentimes the majority of the biomass. And most of that, again, goes into the atmosphere. You know, any tree that's removed from the forest, the majority of that, oftentimes 2/3 or 3/4, goes into the atmosphere. 2/3 or 3/4 of the carbon goes into the atmosphere almost immediately because the branches and treetops are not usable for lumber. The bark, the milling residue, that's incinerated for energy production. Only a very small portion ends up in a lumber product somewhere. So logging is the true carbon bomb, not fires. Logging in US forests emits 10 times more carbon than fire and native beetles combined every year in the US. So we really need to start curbing those carbon emissions from logging. So the upshot is, beware of legislation claiming to promote forest health, fuel reduction, restoration, or reforestation. Beware of terms like thinning. We need to keep the carbon in the ground, and we need to keep the carbon in our forests in order to overcome the climate crisis. And I'll be happy to talk more about that in Q&A. And I'm going to stop screen sharing and turn it back over to Elaine.
Thanks, Chad. You have given us so much to think about and to consider. And I want to make sure, in the interest of time, that we hear from Maya, because I think that she's going to also talk about some on the ground examples as well. So let's bring up Maya. Thank you, Maya, for being here with us and sharing your experiences. Are you going to share your screen?
Oh, hi, Elaine. No, I can't share my screen because I'm on the road. A lot of what I do is being out in the field in some of those areas that Chad and Gary have described so thoroughly. So my time is, a lot of my time is out in the field. I did share a few of the photographs with you that represent areas I'm very concerned about. And yeah, I mean, those can be passed on in addition to, a set of others that I do have. So, but I think that, to be honest, Gary's and Chad's presentations are so visually oriented and so rich. And a lot of what I'm going to say is the on-the-ground ground truthing of what they're coming up with. So should I just go right ahead?
Absolutely, please do.
Okay, thanks so much. I'm Maya Khosla. I'm really, really happy to be here among you illustrious scientists. I was so delighted to be listening in on the soils component and the regenerative agriculture component. I just think they all add up beautifully to when we're trying to do whatever we can to stop or mitigate for climate change. And I think stepping out the way Gary Hughes and Dr. Chad Hansen have into the forests, which is what we don't really see as much. It just seems from those two presentations, and I'm really glad they went first, there's an overwhelming amount going on behind our backs or in the large, what we would consider larger backyards, that what can we do about it would be the first question. I mean, it's so huge. What can we do about it? You fly over it. Some of you have seen all the scattershot of clear cuts all over the place, but you don't see the thinning as much because you've got tree cover, but the thinning is just as dangerous as Chad's maps have shown. It contributes very often to the component of very fast, dangerous, and often intense fires. So I'm going to get on the ground, and which is where I am right now, and talk a little bit about Sonoma County and the concerns I have with what's these terms that are being used. And then also I'm going to try to talk a little bit about what can we do, given that it's so overwhelming what's happening in our own larger backyards, if you will. Forest and fire is a red hot topic right now. We in Sonoma County have suffered from forest fire, actually not so much forest fires, but ember driven storms that firestorms that come through communities, and then there's a lot of destruction of homes. People have a misunderstanding, which is very similar to those the presenters that have just preceded me. The misunderstanding is that that if we clear the forests away, those fuels can be managed and we'll be safe. This is a very dangerous perception to have, because embers are flying a mile ahead of the fire. So whatever the fuels are, it's the embers that are doing the job of going for homes that are not hardened. That's such a huge concern. And then the homes that are not hardened, with the oak tree coming, shading over the eaves, or redwood trees brushing up against the windows. There's a very famous poet who has the poem about the redwood and the house, Jane Hirschfield. Some of you may be familiar with. And the problem there is there's no defensible space being considered, and the home is made of materials that are sort of flammable. And once the forest fire crosses into the urban boundary, it's no longer really a forest fire. It's conflagrations are going from house to house. And these are, as the speakers before have mentioned, so easy to prevent, because defensible space and home hardening are very tangible elements that we can incorporate into homes to make us safer, rather than vegetation management of the forests and of oak woodlands and of chaparral vegetation, which is going on in Sonoma County. Now, Sonoma has suffered so much that FEMA money and PG&E money is coming by the million into Sonoma, and a vast majority of it right now is being used for so-called vegetation management. This is something to be really wary of, this term, in addition to what was mentioned as reforestation. You think it's such a happy word. What could be worse? Reforestation. We see an area that doesn't have forest, where forest belongs, we reforest it. But this term reforestation is going to be used in the context of vegetation management to first clear cut, smash all the seedlings that naturally regrew, including the redwoods that are so good at regrowing after the fire, and most of which were alive when they've been removed by the thousand. And then replanting, and that's being called restoration, and that's gaining carbon credits. So I would say that if there would be one thing to do, is be very aware of the fire, forest, industrial complex, and the language they use to woo me and you into thinking that, wow, they're doing a great job and they're getting all the carbon credits in the world. The problem is they're not. What's happening on the ground is they go in and they select the largest trees. Yes, they mark them often with blue paint. And then when the crews go in, the crews want the bang for the buck. So they take out those largest trees. They'll take out a few small trees that are close to roads or close to a phone pole, utility line. But mostly they're there to take out the largest trees. And one of my friends who's very concerned, there's multiple homeowners and landowners west of Healdsburg, the LNU fire complex, where the redwoods burned, but they were alive. They do great after fire. A lot of them were alive. The ones that weren't alive were serving as wonderful habitat. As Chad mentioned, black-backed woodpecker. Here in Sonoma County, we have hairy woodpecker. We've got the ladderback, the Nuttall's woodpecker. They all use these snags because that's the wood they can carve into to build their homes. And then other scores of other birds use the unused homes that woodpeckers, the carpenters of the forest, create. So we had snags lined up. We had redwood trees that were alive with epicormic branching. And boom, they were all either slated for cutting or already cut by the time I got there. In fact, several neighbors wanted to pool their resources together so that I could do some filming on the beautiful regrowth and the bobcats, mountain lions, deer, and foxes that were returning to or already denning in those areas that were already burned and given up for dead, so to speak, you see. But those areas were gone long before I could even start the documentation process. And a lot of times these epicormic branching processes take a while. It's not like nature is this, light switch that, the fire goes by and I'm alive, so I'm going to show the world I'm alive. It takes a little time for them to sort of catch a breath and then quite literally just green out, leaf out with oaks, even Doug firs, some of the Doug firs, and particularly the redwood trees, which are highly valuable lumber. So before any of that leafing out could take place, a lot of people were getting from CAL FIRE emergency permits to do removals. Hundreds of acres of removals were being done, thousands. So I have some aerials. So we were just shocked. You can't really document anything. You can't even really officially determine the fire intensity, because that's a measure of how much live and how much dead. So if it's all cut, they can all say it burned really hot and everything was dead, but you'll never really know the truth. So my take home message, because I know we've got, we have a discussion and it's going to be really rich with all the details ahead, Q&A, I mean, is to, whenever you see a planned project, whether it's California Air Resources Board that Gary mentioned, whether it's US Forest Service or CAL FIRE that Chad mentioned, whenever you see a project funded by those agencies, ask a question. I mean, a lot of this is about, what the heck can I do? It's so big. Ask that question. Is this really about restoration? Is this really what I want? And is this really deserving of carbon credits? For the most part, it will not be, because all they want is the lumber. They're really so hungry for the lumber that when I walked on the land in Sonoma County, west of Healdsburg again, with my friend Julia, who just thought, by the way, that she and I talked a lot, and I asked her, just don't log. It's not going to make you safe. It's not going to be good for the forest, and it's probably not going to get you a whole lot of money. She did, because, the family pressure. And so she did log, thinking that she would be able to build a new home after post-fire salvage logging, because CAL FIRE gave her an emergency permit. We're not even going to look at this property. Anything where the grass was touched by fire near the tree, not even that the tree burned, the grass near the tree was touched by fire, that tree could be logged. And so they had such a clear cut, and she had to pay for the road, for the diesel, for the operators, for all the work that they did, to subtract that from the profit. And then on top of that, they left slash piles. I mean, as high as some of the young trees, huge slash piles. She didn't know what to do with that are in massive fire risk, because they're the shape of bonfires. And they just left this dry fuel, just literally in these pyramid shapes, left and right of the roads that we were walking. And she was just literally in tears. She said, now I have to pay for this too. And I don't even know if I'm going to break even. Forget about being able to build another home that, to replace the one that was burnt down. So, I can't say enough to emphasize what my the previous speakers have been talking about. And I want to say, please, write to folks, write to the agencies. Whenever you see a sign-on letter, add your comments, go to, the Biofuels Watch page and or the John Muir Project page, see what's available for signing on, or ask them directly now that you probably have their emails, and just keep an eye open, because even whether it comes to universities, agencies, you would never know, and even some nonprofits, they've all bought into this idea that has really, the science is so flawed that it's literally fallen out under the premise that they're using to do major logging. the science is not even there. So that would be my request to everyone is please just pay attention to those types of large agency projects. Cal Fire, for example, wanting to remove 500,000 acres per year in our forests for the next 20 years. That's part of their vegetation management plan. So that's where I'm going to close, and hopefully we'll have some time for Q&A. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Maya. And then I just want to say a couple of other just things in summary. We could do a whole nother event, I think, about the misconceptions and fallacies around market-based solutions and carbon credits. We could talk about that again in the future. That is a subject we haven't really delved into yet with the CEMTF, so opportunities there. And our guests have just done such a good job at kind of informing and building awareness about the types of things that, myself included, many of us have well-intentioned, have been, I think, misinformed about for a long time. And it's just about time that we get educated and we try to spread the word and grow awareness and maybe think about the types of things that Maya suggested, contacting agencies, contacting elected officials, and letting them know that we're concerned about these things and we're paying attention, letting people know that we're paying attention. With that, unfortunately, I'm very sad that we don't have time for Q&A, but I think I'm going to hand this over to Amos. And
well, yeah, I was going to say, if you guys want to, it's a break. Folks, this is a webinar. You can come and go as you please. Terrence is taking a break, no reason we need to go dark. If you want to take some questions now over the next 5 minutes, we can do that if you're comfortable with that, Elaine.
I'd be happy to if
Good.
Chad and
yeah, we've got Maya right here in the car. I want to take advantage of her brilliance and the work at that and knowledge that Chad and you guys have dropped here. And there's a lot of good information there in the chat. Why don't you see if there's a couple questions you want to pitch them? Open up your mics here, Chad, Maya, and who else am I missing?
Gary.
Where'd he go? Gary, are you still with us?
He's with us.
Okay.
Okay, so yeah, so basically this is your opportunity to take a break, but we're going to see if we can't field a question or two from our panelists. So let's see, there were so many. Let me see. Okay, the first question that was asked about the Livermore Labs proposal on biomass gasification to achieve negative emissions. And I think this question was for Chad. Can somebody quickly speak about that?
Sure. In the interest of time, I'll be very brief, and I know Maya and Gary may want to say something on this too. But I'll just say that Lawrence Livermore Laboratories proposal, which is a DOE proposal that came out of the Trump administration, it is a climate change nightmare. It's based on the absolute discredited fallacy that somehow you can incinerate trees for energy and capture almost all or all the carbon. In fact, that's been shown to not be true over and over and over again. And they want to build thousands of miles of CO2 pipelines, which would require enormous emissions and energy, and then pump the CO2 underground, which increases earthquakes, and that increases catastrophic release of CO2, which puts communities at risk, which we saw recently in Mississippi. It also threatens ecosystems. So this is not the path forward, and we really need to strongly reject these kinds of false climate solutions.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I would just quickly add that Getting to Neutral report, politically has received really strong support from the fossil fuel industry because they picture that kind of frame allows them to sell the public on the idea that we can keep using fossil fuels and deal with the pollution afterwards. So we're very concerned about the public relations campaigns that have also accompanied the release of that report since early 2020. So I'm glad we brought it up here to just kind of identify that there's some informed opposition to that approach.
Okay, great, thank you. I'd like to get this question out there because I do think this one's important. And this is about forest management in the areas around housing. So, the question is, how much of it is an issue is it that we're building more and more housing in wooded areas? And maybe if you could comment on that.
I think that's probably best for Maya on that one.
Sure, Chad. Yeah, I belong to an area where people are going further and further into the what is known as the wildland urban interface and pursuing thinnings that I examined shortly after the 2020 glass fire as just one example. There's many, but you know, they decided to thin the area around their homes. They thought they were good and the homes burned down. And this is because along St. Helena Road, along Calistoga Road, that glass fire went, you know, through those canyons really fast, and no amount of thinning was going to help it because they didn't have defensible space. They didn't have home hardening. And so it's extremely important to do some vegetation management. I would say the best thing I would say in this short amount of time is just please look up Dr. Jack Cohen's work. There's several videos out there. He's done amazing classic studies. A lot of his work has been ignored. It's just what's significant is about 100 feet around the home. I mean, it could be even less. He started with 30 to 60, and now the Cal Fire's made it 100 just to sort of round it off. It's fine to keep it at 100, you know, if you have to, especially if you're on a steep slope. But I really do think that his videos are great. His publications are great. Chad has some very a great publication in LA Times. If you look up LA Times Latuna Fire Chad Hansen, it's a wonderful example of how home hardening just like nailed it for an entire community. So that's veg management plus home hardening on the, you know, right around the homes, but not far from them, not like 500-600 feet, 1 mile away, but just around the homes themselves.
Yeah, and I think the Chad in his presentation also commented on like how we could incentivize that hardening of homes, maybe with subsidies or other kind of financial incentives too. Okay, I don't think we have time for more questions. So
yeah, thank you so very much for that.
Thank you all for opening our eyes to this vitally important topic. I know my eyes have been opened, and I am reading Chad's book, not to make a plug, but it's very good. And it's really been illuminating, and this whole discussion has been illuminating. Thank you all so much for being here.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Good. We're going to move right. We're going to move right to our third and final panel on protecting marine ecosystems with Sylvia Gibson and Liz Taylor. Liz is with Dura Marine, and Sylvia will be talking with her on San Francisco Bay Hope Spot that they have. Sylvia, I lost you there. There you go. Go ahead and unmute yourself and go away.
Great. First, I'm just honored to be here at this great council of human beings speaking for the planet and for future generations of human beings. And I'm here with Liz Taylor, who is the president of Dura Marine, and we're going to be talking about San Francisco Bay Hope Spot. But first of all, Dura Marine is, Dura stands for Deep Ocean Exploration and Research. And Liz also runs the Explore store here in Alameda, which brings people, gives them opportunities to go and get into the ocean up close. So, and we have a couple slides to share about the Hope Spot. And I'm Sylvia. I'm an educator and environmental activist and a Hope Spot champion, together with Dr. Karina Nilsson, who couldn't be here today. And she is the director of San Francisco State University's Estuary and Ocean Science Center. And together we championed San Francisco Bay to be a Hope Spot. And I think we have some slides. Is somebody helping us with the slides?
Yeah, Laura will be doing that.
Okay, maybe the first slide about what Hope Spots are. Awesome. Yeah, so Hope Spots are special places around the planet, in the blue part of the planet, that are critical to the health of the ocean. And they're championed by Sylvia Earle, who and her organization called Mission Blue. And yeah, so I guess next slide. Great. San Francisco Bay Hope Spot is unique because it's an urban area. A lot of the hope spots are in, very more remote areas. San Francisco Bay Hope Spot really takes into account the connection between human activity and the health of the ocean. And there you see the Mission Blue logo, and also the Estuary and Ocean Science Center, who partner together to create the Hope Spot. And it really is a partnership between scientists and citizens to protect the oceans, to protect and restore the health of the bay in this case. And now I think we have a quick video clip from Sylvia Earle herself about the San Francisco Bay Hope Spot.
Sylvia, you want to say a little bit about who Sylvia Earle is and why we know who she is?
I'll let Liz say that. Liz,
Right.
Can you tell us a bit about Sylvia Earle?
Sure, absolutely. So Sylvia Earle's an oceanographer and one of the first explorer in residence with National Geographic Society, and founder of Mission Blue, and the founding members of the Ocean Elders. She's been working in the sector for her entire life. I'm her daughter, so it doesn't fall far from the tree in terms of really caring about the ocean and environmental restoration, and realizing all the impacts. Everything that touches the ocean starts on the land, and vice versa. So it's a very timely group. With the Hope Spots, her goal was to really ignite broader concern for the oceans, and to identify places that A, were in pretty good shape and worth protecting, and B, in really poor condition, like the San Francisco Bay, and really in need of our collective efforts to restore them. It is truly cause for hope that we're able to, come together and work in a collaborative fashion between scientists and the general public to make a real difference. She certainly talks a lot about being a witness over the course of her life to the enormous losses that and I think everyone on this call has probably seen that as well, the things that we took for granted as kids growing up, the frogs and toads and lizards we used to find, or the diversity of insects we used to see, compared to today. The loss of biodiversity, it's decreased 50% in the last 50 years worldwide. And the San Francisco Bay has been a really impacted area as well. So let's see if the video will play now, and we'll talk about the San Francisco.
I'm Sylvia Earle, founder of Mission Blue, wishing with my whole blue heart that I could be with you in San Francisco, a place that I've known and loved since my first glimpse of this beautiful part of the planet in the 1960s. In the 1960s, for the first time, a glimpse of Earth from space took place. At that time, we are just beginning to understand that what we're putting into the ocean, what we're taking out of the ocean, what we're doing to the land had consequences that were not only damaging to the blue planet, our home, but were damaging to us. The whole idea behind declaring hope spots around the world is to inspire people to do what they can, individually and collectively, around places that they love, to go from a time where we have seen the decline of water quality, the increase of trash in the ocean, the two things, good news, bad news about wildlife. Some kinds of creatures have declined, like squid and tunas and salmon, but others, like whales and otters, have recovered. What's the difference? We've begun to seriously protect marine mammals. the otters and the whales. Their numbers are stronger today than they were in the 1960s. At the same time, we have witnessed a decline of so many other things that can recover if we do the same thing, if we protect them. The idea of having San Francisco Bay as a place where so many people care. More than 7 million people live in the Bay Area. That's 7 million minds and hearts that can be directed to maintaining the good things and improving those that are not so good, not just for the Bay, but for all the people who live here now and certainly far into the future. We have a chance, but that chance is slipping away unless we act right now. And to set an example here in this beautiful city that can be at something that the world can look to and say, well, they can achieve it in a place with high population and with so many people crowded into a small area. If they can do it, maybe we can do it elsewhere in the world. We can set an example. Thank you for doing what you're doing, to do just that, to take the lead in looking at the opportunities that are now before us. We still have seagrass beds in San Francisco Bay. We still, in fact, more otters today than before. There are a lot of problems. There are also opportunities to make a difference. Thank you. I look forward to being back and to diving in with you to make a difference for San Francisco, the latest, maybe the greatest hope spot yet.
Awesome. Thanks. And next slide, please. I'm going to just talk for a minute about the Bay, and then Liz and I are going to have a conversation about things that we all can do to help restore and protect the health of the Bay. But a couple things I found out. Well, one is that the Bay is actually part of a huge estuary system that covers 1,600 square miles and actually drains 40% of California, drains into the Bay. And it's this huge marsh area. And earlier we found out about we heard about the Ohlone people and living through the marshes. And it turns out that this estuary, this freshened seawater marshes, where the sunlight penetrates into the shallow waters, is an amazingly biologically productive area, and is nursery for so many different species. And it turns out, I found this out yesterday, that the estuaries are more biologically productive than coral reefs, and estuaries are more biologically productive than the rainforest. And in fact, estuaries are the most biologically productive areas on planet Earth. So here we are in this amazing bay. And the Bay is also an important stop in the Pacific Flyway of the birds that fly from the Arctic down to South and Central America and back. So much life is happening here on these waters, surrounded by nearly 8 million people who are also living here. So I have a few questions I'm going to ask Liz and have a conversation about what we can do. And the first one is climate change and sea level rise are already impacting the Bay Area. And what are some innovative strategies to adapt to sea level rise that also provide habitat for marine life?
Yeah, so, we talked a little bit about this, and, things that individuals can do, may have been touched on earlier as well, but it's just basic things like reevaluating your landscaping choices, reducing lawn, depaving, putting in pavers versus pavement wherever we can. And then, of course, the use we see in a lot of the new developments, they're incorporating some bioswales to kind of help slow the flow of water when we do have a storm situation, to slow that flow down so we don't see these enormous pulses of contamination, trash, and debris coming into the bay. And it also helps us with the wastewater treatment systems, which are often overwhelmed and are left with no choice but to discharge, raw sewage into the bay. When we get like a large winter storm, it just kind of overwhelms the stormwater systems and the treatment plants. So if we're able to just do what we can to slow down that course of stormwater as it's coming through, we can reduce the amount of trash that gets into the bay, we can reduce the chemical load that comes into the bay, and we can allow better groundwater recharge, particularly in these areas where fires have gone through. We see the problem of the landslides that can happen. And a lot of that is because the water has no place to go, it just sloughs off. The root systems are gone or ripped out or burned and can't retain the water. So there's things we can actively do to slow down that course of the water. It can help enormously to improve the water quality for the bay.
Right. I think you were telling me that it happens. How many times a year does it happen that the sewage treatment center is overwhelmed in a storm? And
we always see
they
these
literally
things
dump it straight to the bay.
Right. Like it's a bad beach day, or there's bacterial levels or E. coli, or it's just unsafe. And I mean, imagine if we all decided that having a swimmable bay is really important to us all. They've done it in New York. They have the Billion Oyster Project there that I've been working with. And the New York Harbor went from this area where, you'd be afraid to put your little toe in that water to a place where people are, again, returning to swim. Here in Alameda, we have people complain all the time when it's a hot day that, oh, there's no pools, that we have no access to pools. But the bay is right there. But a lot of people are nervous to swim in it because they're concerned about water quality. But if we actively work to improve that water quality, starting on the land, and then moving into the bay with restoration of things like the seagrass beds, which are, as you say, so critically important and an amazing carbon capture area. And then the native oyster restoration work, mussels, the shellfish, all those animals that filter the water, capture carbon, and help improve the water quality for everyone.
For sure. And another goal of the Hope Spot is to provide broad and equitable access to all residents of the Bay Area to the water. So once we have this clean water, and we want everybody to be able to get on it and paddle and to get in it and swim. So how can we achieve this? Or what are some ways that we can make sure that everyone has access to getting in and on the water of the Bay?
Well, I think it's important that everyone kind of helps to protect and demand working access to the water. We've seen it systematically, walled off, fenced off. Like every time somebody does some new shoreline project, the first thing they do is they put up a fence to keep people from accessing the water. They lay down a bunch of riprap so that it's very uninviting to actually come down onto the interface between the shore and the bay. And there's nothing better than seeing a kid out there with a hand lens or grabbing up a cup of water and bringing it back and putting it under a microscope and just watching that sense of wonder that they have when they're able to really go down and get wet and dirty. Sylvia Earle likes to say, no child should be left dry. And no adult should be either. We really need to forge these reconnections with the bay and the ocean beyond. And one of the best ways we can do that is by when we do need to put in some kind of a barrier or seawall. We're seeing a lot of the seawall reconstruction. It's going to be an enormous problem in San Francisco along the edge there. But why are we just making these sheer walls for the water to bash up against and not mitigate any of that storm energy and to actually create more erosion and turbidity, when instead we could create living seawalls, living shorelines, which will help to provide habitat for these creatures that will benefit us, and also to kind of absorb some of that storm energy. So there's quite a bit that can be done just in the design of the ocean or bay and land interface. So it's a lot to be done there, and a lot of economic benefit to come from that work.
For sure. And as a Hope Spot champion, in addition to educating people about what we can do, like picking up trash and making sure it doesn't get into the ocean, another part of the work is to go to city councils and to planning boards, and to make sure that as we are developing multi-million-dollar condos on the shoreline of Alameda, for example, that there is also broad and equitable access to the water for all people. Yeah,
we have a super interesting situation going on, as you say, at Alameda Point. There's the so-called Seaplane Lagoon, and it's kind of a cool area. There's a humpback whale in it, not too long ago, and it made all the news channels. But one of the coolest things about it is that it has these historic ramps that go down directly into the bay, where seaplanes used to go in and out, and they're so inviting and such an amazing resource and asset, and they're historic. So we should keep them. But at the same time, I've watched this sort of corner of the Seaplane Lagoon being redeveloped, and it's really a bit disappointing, because we see that there's no native plants being put in. There's kind of steps that lead down little steps, but they don't really go anywhere. They don't connect people to the water or invite them to the water. And I have this fear that I'm going to walk by there one day and there's going to be a fence to keep people from even thinking about touching the water. But I'm very hopeful that the Seaplane Lagoon ramps will stay where they are, so that we have some way for people to, put in a kayak or a paddleboard, or just, put on a wetsuit, fins, and snorkel and snorkel around with the bat rays that are out there. I think that'd be really cool.
And that makes me think of another aspect of our work, which is citizen science.
Right.
Like, what would be some examples of of just citizen science that either have happened or
there's a lot of opportunities around the bay. Everything from reporting, bird life to the Golden Gate Audubon Society. The lagoon out here has the least tern, which is a famous endangered species. And they are always interested to find out. And there's concern now because of all the increase of lighting that comes along with the development. So it's another big thing, is the light pollution that we're facing, and what impacts will that have not only on the birds and insects, but also casting that light now into the bay, and what impact that has on some of the species that come into the seagrass beds to spawn and so forth. Will we impact those as we work to try to restore these areas? So there's a lot to be done there. We're kind of collaborate both with Mission Blue. The Aquarium of the Bay is another great resource. It has some citizen science programs, the Academy of Sciences additionally, and of course the Romberg Center over there, where Karina is. They all have programs where individuals can report findings. It's great to just be, never give up that curiosity that we all are born with, to observe, document, and report on what you see. If you see something that looks wrong, or report it. If you see somebody like picking up a whole basket full of periwinkles or something off the shore, or turban snails, and you think there's something going on, you can report it to like the Cal tip at Fishing and Wildlife. So there's a lot of resources that people have. It's just a matter of how do we help connect people to the resources, so that they can help, whether they're a photographer, a writer, whatever they're good at, there's something that they can do to help in this restoration effort around the bay.
For sure. And there's also some really surprisingly simple things that I had never thought about until I started speaking with you and Sylvia Earle. One of them is that the synthetic clothing and the impact on the bay. And I know at your store, that you sell something, but can you talk about that for a second?
Well, sure. As fall and winter come along, we see the uptick in, everybody drags their fleece clothing out of the closet or out of the bins and starts to wear that more. But our clothing often sheds these microplastics and they go right through the wash. They aren't really captured effectively either at the home level and from the washer drain, or as they get out into the wastewater treatment plants. Again, the filtration is not adequate to capture those microfibers. So there are things like we have the Cora Ball, which is a product that's designed to help prevent the shedding of microfibers from your clothing, and then to capture it and train it before it ever gets into the drain. But but just the choices that we have in the purchases of the kinds of clothing that we choose to wear, and to try to pick things that are low shedding, and again can be recycled at life end. That's one of the biggest things, is just making better consumer choices, because there is no away. We love to throw things away, but there's no away.
Right.
It all ends up somewhere, and oftentimes it ends up in the bay and beyond. One of our big remotely operated vehicles that we built for the University of Hawaii, we were out doing some test dives with that for the first time, and we were out in 4,000 meters of water off of Oahu. And we got down to the seabed and we turned on the lights and cameras, and there was a Dasani water bottle sitting on the seabed. So it's everywhere, and a lot of it is on the bottom of the bay. We've seen it helping NOAA out on the bay, and the amount of derelict fishing gear that's in the bay is really unbelievable. It's nets, it's lure, it's line, it's ropes, it's traps. There's all kinds of stuff out there. But because the bay looks nice from the surface, we don't really think about the things that are falling in and left there.
Yeah, and so the hope spot is called a hope spot because there is hope. The future of the bay.
Absolutely, there's so much we can be doing.
Yeah,
and that's the great thing is, we don't want to be doom and gloom about it, but everything that everybody on this call that's concerned about doing things upland, in the forests, on the watershed, in the fire burned areas, around homes, around urban planning, all those things tie together through directly as part of the water cycle, and it all helps to improve the quality of the bay, which comes back and improves our health. We don't want to eat anything out of you get these health warnings, don't eat stuff out of the bay because it's going to be contaminated with heavy metals and all this other stuff. And Alameda used to be called Oyster Island because of the abundance of native oysters that we had right around the island. And Jack London himself was kind of a nefarious oyster poacher, and he'd sell them in carts on Webster Street. And but with the gold rush era, all that silt came down through the big estuary system that you talked about, that big pulse of water, and smothered those oyster beds. But we can bring them back, and we can improve the quality of the bay in doing that.
Good. Well, I want to thank you to Sylvia and Liz, really, for an engaging discussion here. As always, Sylvia, it's such a pleasure to have you here and to really bring this forward on the hope spot. I know we have 10 minutes up. We're going to move on to, we won't have time for Q&A on this. There are some really, and actually you answered a number of those, Sylvia, in the question. You want to make a point there? Go ahead.
I did. Yeah, I'd like to give people opportunity to get involved. If
Good.
we show the next slide. Yeah, just if you want to get involved with the work of the Hope Spot, because another thing, it helps, I believe it helps that our mental health to be able to do some meaningful work here. And so the SFA Hope Spot actions getting involved. We have online meetings that are starting third Thursdays of the month. You can email the sfahopespot@gmail.org if you want to be invited to those. Also, I'm writing a Hope Spot resolution with the help of many people, and to bring to the Alameda City Council with what the City Council can influence in terms of decision-making around the health of the bay. And we'd also, after bringing the resolution to Alameda, would like to bring it to all communities, to the City Councils of every city in the Bay Area. So everyone is focusing on the health of the Bay. And we're organizing cleanups and paddles and celebrations. So I hope to hear from you all. And it's just been amazing to be with this group, very inspiring work, making me feel like, we're never alone here. We're all doing the part that we can. And thank you to the organizers too, Amos.
Yeah,
thank you. Indubitably. Thank you so very much, Sylvia. I want to say we're going to move along to Jack. And Laura saved or shared it in the chat, the information for Mission Blue and the Hope Spot. So please look in the chat, folks, to follow up with that information. If you didn't get a chance to catch it off of the slide, it's here in the chat as well. And with that, Jack, we're going to take us out for this fourth summit of ours.
Okay, well, thanks, Amos. And wow, it's just pretty overwhelming, mind-blowing, these presentations today. It's just really been fantastic. I took a lot of notes and just kind of filled my brain with all sorts of new ideas. I have to admit, I'm one of these people that thought thinning might be a good idea. You know, hey, this is really important information, and I think it's something that we all need to take in and really act on with our elected officials. I'm putting in the chat right now a link to the toolkit that we, thanks to Elaine McCarty for helping put this together. And it's not complete. These are kind of ongoing projects. I added a bunch of stuff today. Some of it doesn't have links, and so we'll continue to add more links and details. But this is like one of the goals of these summits, is to come up with toolkits as to what cities, counties, regional governments, and we as individuals can do. And there's lots of links here that give you information about ideas and practices that you can follow up and get involved with. And speaking of getting involved, we have 2 more summits to come. The next one is going to be on the topic of just transition and Green New Deal. And oh gosh, now do I have the date in my mind? Did I put it in
October 15th.
October 15th. Okay, third Friday of October, and then again, third Friday of November would be the final final summit. And I guess I just wanted to say, on the topic of just transition, our steering committee of the CEMTF this week had a very good discussion about how this could be an ongoing organizing theme for the CEMTF following this round of summits. So this next summit will be very important in terms of thinking about where do we go from here? How do we really address this climate crisis in a just way that really moves us forward as a whole society together? And I think today had a lot of very sobering information, but also a lot of very hopeful information. And that's what we try to do in these summits. So thank you, everybody. I'm going to turn it over to Cheryl for her departing remarks. And again, I think, Cheryl, you put in the evaluation form. I put it in earlier, and we will mail it out to everybody because we do appreciate getting your feedback after these events, hearing what you thought about everything. So Cheryl, go ahead.
Thank you, Jack, and thank you, everyone. I was just looking for my my final remarks on my. I've been taking so many notes. I now have like 32 pages, so it's been wonderful. So thank you to the CEMTF Steering Committee, the Planning and Logistics, Legislative and Design, and Outreach committees, and to all who have attended all the CEMTF second virtual summit series, United Actions for an environmentally just and regenerative future. Today it was the ecological protections. On October 15th, it's going to be just transition in the Green New Deal. November 20th, it's going to be United Climate Actions to end it out. And I also want to thank all the panelists and the speakers. Thank you, Karina. Thank you, Jack. Thank you, Elaine. Thank you, Amos. Thank you, Ruth. Thank you, Anthony, Kevin, Cala, Chad, Maya, Gary, Sylvia, and Liz. I mean, my gosh, this was just like so amazing. And I learned so much, and I hope you all did too, because it's just been really incredible. Some things like I haven't thought about, maybe you haven't either, but we can expand our horizons and do what we can to save our planet, save our lives, save our futures for our children and for the rest of the people that will come after us. And, you know, it's always such a blessing to have Karina here in the beginning to ground us. And remember that Sigurte Land Trust and Shumi Land Tax. And I've seen quite a few people that I recognize that have come to our events over and over again. And I think I appreciate that. I saw one elected official that I recognized in the audience today, and I want to thank him, Dan Kalb, for being here. But, you know, we've had quite a few elected officials, community organizers, activists, And it takes a village. We have to make sure our future is going to be here. And as we can see from the panelists today, some of these things that we thought were good aren't so good. So we need to make sure that, you know, we're doing the right thing. We're supporting all the legislation that needs to get supported, and the officials that are leading those charges. And Sylvia, please send us the CEMTF, that HOPE ordinance, because we'll try to push that through as well. And we're even ending early today. We still have a few more minutes, but it's just been such a great experience for me. My son actually got me on the whole climate push back when I was running and when I got into office. And I thank him. I have to thank him every time, because, you know, he was the one that Googled climate emergency and made sure that I understood what an emergency it is. And boy, is it an emergency. So, you know, every day, you know, we're faced with challenges. We just have to remember to love ourselves, you know, keep that love for ourselves so that we can love others and love our planet and love everything else. So please stay healthy, be safe, wear your mask, double mask, keep your distance. And I'm praying for a better tomorrow. And with all of you, we can have one. So again, thank you so much for being here. We hope to see you in October 15th. Thank you to all the volunteers and to all the people that are behind the scenes that you don't see, that help get this these summit series going. And I understand some folks had a little bit of an issue finding the link today. I got a couple emails. So I apologize for that. If you had a problem getting in, we'll try to do better in the future. And just stay tuned and we'll see you soon. And also, I just wanted to let you know, we've been going since February, I think 7th, 2019, the Climate Emergency Mobilization Task Force was their first meeting. And we've been meeting monthly ever since. But then we just recently decided to go bi-monthly. So we're gonna have our next meeting October, I think it's 20th. And then we're gonna take off December because of all the holidays and people aren't always available. And we'll start back up again January 20th. So we'll see you October 15th. I hope you enjoyed today, because I know I did. Stay healthy, be safe, everyone. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Cheryl.
And thank you, Cheryl.